You're lying there in the dark, maybe scrolling through food delivery apps, debating between pizza and Thai, when suddenly you think, what did people even eat before all this? Well, friend, buckle up, because tonight we're diving into the truly unbelievable foods that medieval Europeans considered the height of culinary sophistication. And I'm not talking about roasted chicken or hearty stews, I'm talking about dishes so bizarre, so utterly alien to our modern palates, that you probably won't survive this menu without gagging at least once. Picture this, it's 1327, and you've just been invited to a royal banquet. The great hall glows with hundreds of tallow candles, their animal fat smoke curling toward the timber ceiling. Servants in livery parade through the crowd, carrying enormous platters, and on one of them, glistening whole, its mouth frozen in a permanent scream, lies a lamprey eel glazed with wine and spices still wearing its own slime like a badge of honour. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing this little community spans time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The lamprey. You've probably never seen one unless you frequent medieval manuscripts, or have a particularly adventurous aquarium. It's not technically a fish. It's a jawless parasitic creature that latches onto other fish with a circular mouthful of teeth like nature's worst design nightmare. It looks like something H.R. Geiger would sketch after a fever dream. No scales, no bones, just cartilage, slime, and an appetite for blood. And yet for centuries this was the delicacy. Kings requested it. Nobles fought over it. Henry I of England allegedly died from eating a surfeit of lampreys in 1135, meaning he ate so many of these things that his body just gave up. Historians still argue whether it was food poisoning, overeating, or just divine punishment for bad taste, but the point stands, this man loved lamprey enough to die for it. You have to understand the medieval obsession with status through food. Eating wasn't just about nutrition, it was theatre. It was power. And lamprey caught fresh from rivers like the Severn in England represented both rarity and access. Only those with wealth could afford to have servants net these slippery horrors, transport them alive, and prepare them in the elaborate ways cookbooks demanded. The preparation was no joke. First you'd bleed the eel, yes, they bled them like livestock, then poach it in wine with pepper, ginger, and cinnamon. Sometimes they'd stuff it with breadcrumbs and herbs. Other times they'd bake it into pies, its coiled body visible through latticed pastry like a nightmare you could slice. The finished dish shimmered with a glaze made from its own blood mixed with red wine, creating a dark, viscous coating that medieval diners apparently found appetizing. Now imagine yourself at that table. The lamprey arrives on a silver platter, still vaguely eel-shaped, its eyeless head pointing toward you. A servant carves a portion onto your trencher, a thick slab of stale bread that doubles as your plate. The meat is rich, almost liver-like, dense and fatty. The spices hit your tongue first, warm cinnamon, sharp ginger, the heat of pepper cutting through the oiliness. Then comes the texture, soft, slippery, with a faint marine bitterness underneath all that wine and spice. You chew slowly, aware that everyone's watching to see if you'll honour the king's favourite dish. The lamprey's flavour lingers, coating your mouth with fish oil richness and medieval spice. You swallow, you smile. You've just participated in a culinary ritual that will persist for another 2 centuries, until tastes shift and this creature finally falls from grace. But here's the thing, lamprey wasn't just royal food. In certain regions, especially along major rivers, even merchants and wealthy burghers ate it during feast days. It became a Christmas tradition in some areas, a way to show off during religious celebrations when other flashy meats might be forbidden. The church's fasting rules, which we'll explore more later, meant that anything from water technically counted as acceptable during Lent. Lamprey dwelling in rivers qualified. Convenient right. The decline came slowly. By the 16th century, tastes were changing. New World foods were arriving, turkeys, potatoes, tomatoes, and suddenly this prehistoric nightmare fish didn't seem so appealing anymore. Lamprey became associated with old-fashioned excess, the kind of thing your grandparents' grandparents ate before they knew better. Today, lamprey still exists on a few menus in Portugal and Spain, where it's considered a regional specialty. But for most of us, it's vanished entirely from culinary consciousness. We've moved on to salmon and tuna fish that look like fish that don't resemble alien parasites from the deep. Yet for hundreds of years, this was luxury. This was power. This was what you served when you wanted to impress, to intimidate, to prove you had access to waters others didn't. The lamprey wasn't just food, it was a statement. And that statement was, I can afford to eat this horror and you cannot. The lamprey's slime still glistens on your imaginary trencher when the next course arrives, and this time the entire hall gasps. Not because the food smells particularly wonderful, though it does carry that roasted meat aroma, but because of what you're seeing. A peacock. A whole peacock walking toward you. Except it's not walking, of course. It's dead. Very dead. But it's been reconstructed with such meticulous care that for a moment your medieval brain can't quite process it. The bird sits upright on an enormous platter, its iridescent tail feathers fanned out in full display, its head held high by an internal framework of wire or wood. The feathers catch the candlelight blue-green gold shimmering like jewels. Its beak gleams. Even its feet have been preserved, positioned as if it might suddenly stand and strut across the table. This is what passed for Instagram-worthy content in 1380. You lean closer. The smell hits you properly, now roasted meat, yes, but also the faint chemical tang of whatever preservatives they used on those feathers, mixed with the spices rubbed into the skin. Someone, probably several someones, actually spent hours on this presentation. First, they carefully skinned the bird, keeping the feathers completely intact like peeling off an elaborate coat. Then they roasted the naked peacock body with the usual medieval fanfare, larding it with pork fat, basting it with wine, stuffing it with breadcrumbs and herbs. Here's where it gets weird. After roasting, they redressed the bird in its own plumage, stitching the skin back on or securing it with skewers. Some cooks even wired the beak open and stuffed it with wool soaked in spirits, then set it aflame right there at the table. Imagine a bird on fire, seemingly alive feathers, untouched by the flames, while guests applauded this culinary pyrotechnics. Historians still argue whether the fire trick was common practice, or just something rich eccentrics did to one-up each other at tournaments. Either way, the peacock itself was never really about taste. Let's be honest, peacock meat is terrible. It's tough, stringy, and has a slightly gamey flavour that even medieval spices couldn't quite mask. One 15th century cookbook describes it as requiring long simmering to make it tender, which is cookbook code for this bird is basically edible leather. But you didn't serve peacock because it was delicious. You served it because you could. Because you had access to exotic bird-skilled cooks and the sheer audacity to turn dinner into performance art. The whole spectacle played into medieval ideas about food as theatre. Banquets weren't just meals, they were political statements, social negotiations, power displays. When a lord presented a reconstructed peacock, he was saying, "Look at my resources. Look at my refinement. Look at what I can make my kitchen staff accomplish." Other nobles would respond with their own elaborate dishes, escalating the culinary arms race, until someone inevitably served a whole roasted swan. We'll get there. or heaven help us a cockentrice, but that's a horror for later. You watch a servant approach with carving knives. The peacock's carefully arranged feathers tremble slightly as the blade sinks into the breast. The meat beneath is pale, almost grey, nothing like the golden brown chicken you know from modern ovens. The first slice reveals flesh that's been cooked through overcooked, really because medieval cooks feared underdone poultry like we fear food poisoning, which fair enough given their refrigeration situation. A portion lands on your trencher. You pick it up with your fingers, forks are still mostly decorative at this point in history, and take a bite. The texture is exactly as disappointing as promised fibrous dry, requiring serious jaw work. The spices help pepper, cinnamon, cloves masking some of the blandness. You chew, and chew, and chew some more while around you nobles nod appreciatively, murmuring compliments to the host. No one admits it tastes like fancy cardboard. That would be social suicide. The weird thing is, peacock had been fancy since Roman times. Ancient cookbooks mention it alongside dormice and flamingo tongues, all served at elaborate triclinia where guests reclined on couches and ate until they vomited, different times people. When medieval Europe tried to recreate Roman grandeur, at least the fun parts, peacock came along for the ride. It became shorthand for classical sophistication, a way to connect your feast to the glory of antiquity. By the 16th century, though, even nobles started admitting this was ridiculous. Turkey arrived from the Americas offering significantly better meat and similarly impressive size. Peacock slowly retreated from banquet halls to ornamental gardens where it belonged. Today, eating peacock is technically legal in many places, but good luck finding it on any menu. We've collectively decided that some birds are just too beautiful, too impractical, too peacock to eat. But for those few centuries, this was peak luxury. This was what you served at weddings, coronations, and treaty signings. The bird itself barely mattered. It was the presentation, the spectacle, the shared understanding that everyone at that table could afford to waste hours of labour on a mediocre bird dressed in its own flashy corpse. You swallow your last bite of stringy peacock, wash it down with spiced wine, and glance at the kitchen doorway. More servants are emerging, carrying another implausible dish. The meal is just beginning. Your stomach quietly wonders if it'll survive till morning. The peacock's feathers are being cleared away when you notice something odd about the next platter. It's fish, clearly fish, but the size is wrong. This isn't some dainty trout or even a respectable salmon. This is a massive slab of dark meat glistening with rendered fat, carved from something that must have weighed as much as a small horse. The servant announces it proudly, porpoise caught fresh from the channel, prepared according to the bishop's own recipe. Wait. Porpoise, that adorable marine mammal that swims alongside boats clicking and whistling. Yes, that one. And it's being served on a Friday. You see, the medieval church had very specific rules about fasting, and by specific I mean creatively interpreted to suit whoever had the most influence. Wednesdays, Fridays. Lent, Advent, various saints' days all required abstaining from meat. But here's where it gets deliciously absurd. The definition of meat was surprisingly flexible. Anything that lived in water, technically fish, didn't matter if it breathed air, nursed its young, or had a brain capable of complex thought. Water-dwelling meant fish, and fish meant fasting approved. So porpoise, dolphins, whales, all completely acceptable for Lent. Even seals made the cut, their whiskered faces notwithstanding. Monks along coastlines built entire economies around this loophole, hunting marine mammals with the church's full blessing. Some monasteries kept detailed records of their catches, 12 porpoises in March, 8 seals in November, 1 small whale jackpot in February. all consumed during periods when eating a chicken would send you straight to confession. The logic, such as it was, came from old classification systems that cared more about habitat than biology. If it swam, it was fish. If it flew, it was fowl. If it walked, it was meat. Simple. Never mind that a porpoise gives live birth and feeds its calf milk just like your cow. Never mind that cutting into one reveals flesh that's dark red, almost beef-like. Nothing like the white flaky stuff you'd find in a cod. The rules said fish, so fish it was. You examine your portion. It's been roasted with onions and herbs, but even through the seasoning you can smell something different. Richer, almost metallic. The texture when you bite down is dense muscular with a faint marine sweetness underneath. It's not unpleasant exactly, but your brain keeps screaming that this is definitely, absolutely 100% not fish. This is mammal. This is meat. This is everything you're supposedly not eating on a Friday. But everyone around you is chewing contentedly secure in their theological loophole. A bishop 3 seats down even compliments the preparation, noting how the meat is properly mortified, medieval speak for well-seasoned and tenderized. No one's conscience troubles them. The porpoise swam, therefore it's fish, therefore God approves. Case closed. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed this classification, or just enjoyed the convenient fiction. Some scholars point to legitimate medieval confusion about animal taxonomy. They didn't have modern biology after all. Others suggest it was pure cynicism, rich folks finding ways to eat what they wanted while technically following church law. The truth probably falls somewhere in between some believers, some skeptics all happily eating their water mammals on fast days. The porpoise trade was serious business. Coastal towns had specialized hunters who knew the migration patterns, the best nets, the proper butchering techniques. The meat sold for premium prices, not lamprey level expensive, but definitely above peasant affordability. Monastery account books show regular purchases, suggesting this wasn't occasional, but routine. One 14th century English abbey's records mention porpoise appearing at table 23 times in a single year. That's almost twice a month of marine mammal masquerading as fish. Preparation varied by region. Some roasted it like beef, others made it into pies. A few brave souls even salted and preserved it for long voyages. Cookbooks recommended serving it with sharp sauces, vinegar based heavy on the mustard to cut through the oily richness. The fat rendered from porpoise and whale was prized, too, used in cooking, or sold to chandlers for lamp oil. Nothing went to waste when you'd invested in hunting something that size. Whale was the ultimate catch, of course. When one beached or got trapped in a harbour, it was basically a community lottery win. The meat could feed a monastery for weeks, the blubber rendered into barrels of oil, the bones sold for tool-making. Queens occasionally claimed whales as royal property, the head for the king, the tail for the queen, according to some bizarre medieval precedent. Imagine arguing property rights over a beached whale carcass, while insisting it's legally a fish. By the 16th century, this whole charade started crumbling. Protestant reformers mocked the fish loophole as Dian Xing Catholic hypocrisy. Medical knowledge improved, making the mammal-fish distinction harder to ignore. And frankly, as fishing techniques got better, there was less need to hunt dolphins when you could just catch actual fish. The practice lingered in some isolated communities. Iceland still has a tradition of eating whale, though divorced from religious justification. But for most of Europe, the age of fasting porpoise quietly ended. You finish your portion washing it down with ale. The taste lingers, that strange sea mammal richness that's neither fish nor fowl nor proper meat. Somewhere in your mind a small voice wonders what the porpoise would think about its theological reclassification. Probably nothing complimentary. The porpoise platter is being replaced, and you're starting to feel that particular medieval fullness, the kind that comes from rich fatty meats piled on top of each other, without any vegetables to speak of. But the parade continues because banquets aren't about satisfying hunger. They're about endurance, about proving you can consume excess with grace. This time the servants carry something that makes even the peacock look modest, a swan. Whole naturally, because why serve anything in pieces when you can present the entire animal? Like the peacock, this one's been roasted and redressed in its plumage, its long neck curved in that elegant S shape. Swans do its white feathers gleaming in the candlelight. But there's something different here, something heavier in the air. This isn't just showmanship. This is legal territory. You see, you can't just go grab a swan. Not in medieval England, anyway. Swans belong to the crown. Every single one swimming in English waters is technically royal property, unless specifically granted to someone by royal charter. Earls, bishops, wealthy landowners, they might own swans, but they'd better have documentation. Poach a swan, and you're not just stealing dinner. You're committing treason-adjacent theft from the monarch. People have lost hands for less. So when a swan appears at table, it's not just saying I'm wealthy, it's saying I'm legally entitled to this wealth. It's a flex wrapped in white feathers and backed by royal decree. The practice of swan marking goes back centuries. Cygnets were rounded up each summer and marked with specific cuts or brands on their beaks identifying which noble family owned them. Some marks were simple notches, others elaborate patterns that required actual documentation to decode. The Worshipful Company of Vintners still does this on the Thames every July in a ceremony called swan-upping that's equal parts tradition and tourist attraction. Medieval swan marking was less charming and more, don't touch that bird unless you want legal trouble. A servant carves into the breast and you watch the knife work through the roasted skin. The meat underneath is darker than chicken, lighter than the porpoise you just finished. Swan falls somewhere between poultry and game. It's a bird, yes, but one that flies long distances, building up dense muscle. You're about to eat an athlete, basically. Your portion arrives. The first bite confirms what you suspected. This is not tender meat. It's not even peacock-level tough. This is work. Your jaw works overtime, breaking down fibers that seem to actively resist chewing. The flavour is intensely gamey, with a slightly fishy undertone from all those aquatic plant swans eat. Medieval cooks tried to mask this with the usual spice artillery, pepper, ginger, galangal, but even cinnamon can't completely hide the fact that swan tastes like a duck that's been hitting the gym. Historians still argue whether people actually enjoyed swan, or just endured it for status reasons. Some cookbooks suggest elaborate preparation methods, days of marinating, slow roasting, basting with wine and honey. Others simply note serve with strong sauce, which is medieval code for you'll need chemical assistance to get this down. But taste wasn't really the point. The point was that a swan at your table meant you had connections. It meant royalty knew your name, or at least knew your family name. It meant you could navigate the complex social hierarchies that controlled everything from bird ownership to marriage alliances. A swan was an edible resume. Children of nobility learned to carve swan as part of their education, not just cutting it properly, carving it following specific techniques with specialized knives understanding which parts went to which rank of guest. The neck meat to your honored visitors, the breast to family, the legs to lesser nobles. Even in death, the swan reinforced social order, its body literally divided according to hierarchy. Young men training for knighthood sometimes swore oaths on roasted swans. The vow of the swan was a thing a ceremonial bird brought to table, and knights would pledge upon it to accomplish some deed. Rescue a lady, avenge an insult, crusade somewhere uncomfortable. The swan witnessed their promise, its white feathers symbolizing purity of intent. Then they'd eat it because wasting good status meat would be ridiculous. Wedding feasts almost demanded swan. The white plumage symbolized the bride's virtue theoretically, and the bird's reputation for mating for life made it romantic shorthand. Never mind that actual swan behavior is more complicated, they're territorial, aggressive, and perfectly willing to find new mates if circumstances require. But medieval symbolism wasn't big on zoological accuracy. Swans were noble, pure, faithful, and that's what mattered for the narrative. The practice started declining in the 16th century like so many medieval delicacies. Partly it was changing taste turkeys again, offering better meat without the legal complications. Partly it was Protestant Reformation questioning the whole elaborate hierarchy of who gets which bird. And partly, honestly, people probably just got tired of pretending swan was delicious when it clearly wasn't. Today, eating swan in England is still technically illegal without proper licenses, though enforcement mostly targets poachers rather than curious foodies. A few traditional dinners livery company banquets. The odd historical reenactment might serve it, but it's rare. The birds swim peacefully on rivers and ponds protected by laws they don't understand, unaware they were once the ultimate power lunch. You swallow your last bite of swan feeling it scrape down your throat. Your jaw aches slightly. The gamey aftertaste mingles with spices and wine, creating something not quite pleasant, but undeniably memorable. Around you, nobles smile and nod, performing satisfaction. Another course survives. The night rolls on. You're still recovering from the swan's aggressive texture when the next dish arrives, and this time you genuinely can't tell what you're looking at. The platter holds maybe 24 small rounded objects each about the size of a walnut, glistening with what appears to be honey glaze. They're brown, crispy, and smell faintly of herbs and wood smoke. A servant leans close and murmurs hedgehog roasted in clay. And beside them, even tinier morsels dormice fattened in ceramic jars until they could barely waddle. Welcome to the small mammal course where medieval cuisine gets genuinely weird. Let's start with hedgehogs because at least those make a certain practical sense. These spiny little creatures were everywhere in medieval Europe. Gardens, forests, hedgerows, and they ate the insects and slugs that plagued crops. Farmers tolerated them, even appreciated them. But they also occasionally ate them, not because hedgehogs were particularly desirable, but because meat was meat, and if you knew the trick, these prickly bundles were actually edible. The trick was clay. You'd kill the hedgehog preferably quickly. Medieval Europe wasn't entirely heartless about this, then coat the entire animal's spines and all in thick river clay. No gutting, no skinning, just wrap it like a ceramic burrito and toss it into the fire. The clay hardens, the hedgehog roasts inside its own makeshift oven, and when you crack it open, the spines pull away with the clay shell. What remains is meat. Small amounts dark and rich clinging to tiny bones. The taste. Honestly, a bit like pork. Hedgehogs are omnivores, after all, eating everything from beetles to fallen fruit. Their meat carries that slightly gamey sweetness you find in animals with varied diets. Medieval cooks would season them with thyme or rosemary herbs that grew wild alongside hedgehog habitats, and sometimes glaze them with honey to offset any remaining wildness. The result was finger food, literally. You picked up the whole roasted body and nibbled around the bones like you were tackling a particularly complicated chicken wing. Hedgehog wasn't really noble food, though. This was peasant fare country folk eating what was available. But it occasionally crept into higher-class kitchens as a curiosity, a rustic novelty, served alongside fancier meats to show the Lord's appreciation for simple pleasures. Translation: we're rich enough to pretend peasant food is charming. Now, dummice. That's where things get genuinely Roman. genuinely excessive and genuinely strange. Dormice, those adorable bushy-tailed rodents that look like tiny squirrels, were a Roman delicacy that medieval Europeans inherited along with aqueduct ruins and bad governance. The Romans kept them in special terracotta jars called gliraria darkness, forcing the dormice into a perpetual semi-hibernation state where they just eat and fatten. Hazelnuts, chestnuts, acorns, the Romans stuffed those jars with the best nuts available, and the dormice would gorge, sometimes doubling their body weight. Then you'd kill them, stuff them with pork forcemeat and pine nuts, more nuts, and roast them. Or you'd just roast them plain, drizzled with honey. The Romans considered dormouse the height of sophisticated eating, right up there with flamingo tongues and peacock brains. Medieval Europeans kept the tradition alive, though it was mostly concentrated in southern regions. Italy, southern France, parts of Spain, where Roman influence ran deepest. The Church occasionally grumbled about it. Some theologians argued dormice should count as meat during fasting. Others claimed their size made them negligible, like eating large insects. The debate never quite resolved, so dormice consumption became regional and occasional rather than widespread. The meat itself is surprisingly rich. All that nut fattening creates flesh that's almost buttery with a delicate sweetness that reflects their diet. You'd pop a whole roasted dormouse in your mouth, they're small enough, and work around the bones with your tongue. The texture is tender, nearly melting, nothing like the tough game meats you've been battling all evening. But here's the thing, eating dormice required infrastructure. You needed those special jars, a steady supply of nuts patience to wait while they fattened. This wasn't, I found a hedgehog in the garden eating. This was planned, cultivated, deliberate, tiny rodent husbandry, which meant it was paradoxically more of a delicacy than hedgehog despite being a smaller animal. Historians still argue whether medieval dormouse eating was genuine tradition or just wealthy eccentrics trying to recreate Roman glory. Probably both. Some Italian noble families definitely kept gliraria and served dormice at special occasions. Other regions just heard about the practice and thought it sounded charmingly classical without actually trying it. You pick up one of the glazed objects, a hedgehog, you're pretty sure based on size. It's sticky with honey still warm from the fire. You bite down carefully, conscious of small bones. The meat is indeed pork-like gamey, but not unpleasant, sweetened by the glaze. You chew-swallow feels slightly ridiculous for eating something that probably lived in someone's woodpile last week. The dormouse you skip. There are limits, even in imagination, to the tiny roasted mammals you're willing to confront in one evening. Around the table, reactions vary. Some guests nibble curiously, others politely decline. This is the kind of course where personal preference gets a tiny bit of leeway, where you can demur without causing offence. The hedgehog plate slowly empties regardless. Waste not, want not, even if what you're not wasting once had adorable little snouts and lived on beetles. The servants clear the small mammal course. Your trencher beneath it all is completely soaked now, bread transformed into a greasy sponge of meat drippings. Soon enough, someone will take it away, maybe to feed servants, maybe to the poor waiting outside. Medieval banquets created cascading economies of leftovers food filtering down through social strata until even dogs got their share. The hedgehog's honey glaze still clings to your fingers when the next presentation commands attention. This time it's birds again, but these aren't waddling waterfowl or barnyard peacocks. These are waders. Long-legged elegant, the kind of birds you'd see standing motionless in marshes at dawn, waiting to spear fish with surgical precision. Crane and heron roasted whole, their improbable legs tucked beneath them, their long necks arranged in graceful curves that seem almost too architectural to be edible. You're looking at what medieval nobles called the high birds, not because they flew particularly high, but because eating them elevated your social standing. These weren't birds you could just grab from a dovecote or purchase at market. These required hunting rights, specialized falconry skills, access to wetlands that somebody powerful owned. These required being the kind of person who had both land and leisure. Crane especially held mystical status in the medieval culinary hierarchy. Ancient texts praised it. Roman cookbooks mentioned it alongside the finest dishes. Medieval hunting manuals devoted entire chapters to the proper pursuit and capture of crane. Kings gifted cranes to favoured nobles. A crane at your table wasn't just food, it was a biographical statement, a resume of your social connections rendered in poultry. The preparation reflected this prestige. Cranes weren't simply roasted. They were larded thin strips of pork fat sewn into the lean breast meat to keep it from drying out during the long cooking process. They were basted constantly with wine butter and their own drippings. Some recipes called for stuffing them with smaller birds, a thrush perhaps, or a lark, creating nested birds like culinary Russian dolls. The wealthy loved this sort of inception bird concept. A servant carves into the crane's breast, and you notice the meat is surprisingly dark, not quite as red as the porpoise, but definitely not white like chicken. Cranes are migratory birds flying enormous distances, and that creates muscle packed with myoglobin. This is athlete meat again, though, hopefully more tender than that nightmare swan. Your portion arrives. The first bite is actually not bad. The larding worked. The meat is moist, flavourful, with a richness that reminds you of duck but leaner. There's a slight gamey edge, sure, but the wine and herb basting softened it into something almost pleasant. You chew, and for the first time tonight you're not fighting texture or masking flavours with mental determination. This is genuinely decent. Which makes sense, actually. Unlike peacocks served for looks or swans served for status, crane seems to have been served because people actually liked it. Medieval cookbooks describe it in glowing terms, suggesting careful preparation and pairing it with complex sauces. One 15th century recipe recommends serving crane with a sauce of wine, cinnamon ginger, and weirdly ground hazelnuts, creating a thick spiced gravy that apparently complemented the meat beautifully. Heron sitting beside the crane on the platter tells a slightly different story. Herons eat fish, exclusively fish, which means heron meat tastes distinctly fishy, something medieval diners actually appreciated on certain occasions. Remember that porpoise as fish logic. Heron occupied a similar category, in some regions not quite fish, not quite foul, but fishy enough that some authorities allowed it during fasting periods. Convenient, right? The taste is exactly as advertised. If duck and salmon had a baby, it would taste like heron. The meat is dark, oily, with that marine quality running through every bite. Medieval cooks tried to work with this rather than against it, serving heron with sharp acidic sauces, vinegar-based, heavy on the verjuice. More on that later, designed to cut through the oiliness. Some recipes even suggested preparing heron the same way you'd prepare fish, poaching it in wine and herbs rather than roasting. Historians still argue whether people genuinely enjoyed heron or just ate it because the church said they could during Lent. Probably both. Some diners undoubtedly loved that intense fishy flavour. Others tolerated it because, look, it's Lent, you're not eating beef, and at least heron is technically fancy. Both birds required serious hunting prowess. Cranes and herons don't just wander into nets. You needed trained hawks, gyrfalcons, for crane, usually their power and speed matching the prey. You needed permission to hunt in wetlands, which meant negotiating with whoever held those territorial rights. You needed the patience to spend dawn hours crouched in marshes waiting for the perfect moment. And then after all their effort, you needed cooks skilled enough to handle these unusual birds. Overcook crane, and you've got expensive boot leather. Undercook heron and the fishiness intensifies into something nearly inedible. The margin for error was slim, making successful preparation another form of showing off. Look, my kitchen staff can handle anything, even temperamental wading birds. By the 16th century, both crane and heron were fading from fashionable tables. Partly this was changing habitats, wetlands drained for agriculture, bird populations declining. Partly it was shifting taste, the same forces retiring peacock and swan. And partly, frankly, it was the arrival of new poultry that tasted better with less effort. Turkey, guinea fowl, even improved chicken breeding all offered more meat, easier preparation, better flavour. Today, eating crane or heron is illegal in most of Europe, both protected under conservation laws. A few historical banquets might feature them under special permits, but mostly these birds wade peacefully through marshes unbothered by human dinner plates. We've decided collectively that some things are prettier alive than roasted. You finish your crane portion genuinely satisfied for the first time tonight. The heron you leave mostly untouched. That fishiness is a bridge too far after everything else. Your stomach is starting to send warning signals about capacity. But the meal continues because medieval banquets don't stop for something as trivial as human digestive limits. You're contemplating the structural integrity of your stomach when something truly bizarre arrives. At first glance, it looks like fish it's being served on a Friday after all, and the church's rules still hover over everything like a well-fed ghost. But as the platter gets closer, you realize you're looking at something that's definitely not a fish. It's dark, it's meaty, and it has... is that skin? Leathery textured skin that looks nothing like scales, a beaver tail. Someone has roasted a beaver tail and is serving it as fish. Let me be clear, a beaver tail looks like a leather paddle that evolution glued onto a rodent. It's flat, scaly, about a foot long, and covered in a distinctive cross-hatched pattern. It looks like something you'd use to spank medieval children who misbehave during Mass. It does not in any conceivable universe look like fish, and yet here it is proudly presented on a fasting day blessed by theological gymnastics that would make an Olympic gymnast jealous. The logic, and I use that word generously, goes like this: beavers live in water, they swim, they have scaly tails, ergo the tail is fish. Never mind that the beaver itself is obviously a mammal, furry and warm-blooded and doing all the mammal things. Never mind that the tail is clearly just a modified limb, not a separate aquatic entity. The tail lives in water, the tail is scaly, the tail is fish. Case closed past the salt. This wasn't some fringe belief held by one eccentric monastery. This was official church policy in many regions. Bishops weighed in. Theologians debated the finer points, and the conclusion repeatedly was that beaver tail qualified as acceptable Lenten fare. Some authorities even extended this logic to the entire beaver. All of it counted as aquatic, so all of it was fine during fasting. Though most drew the line at the tail, perhaps sensing that calling beaver meat fish was pushing credibility a bit far even for medieval standards. The North American fur trade later exploited this loophole enthusiastically. French Catholic trappers in Canada could eat beaver year-round without spiritual guilt, which was convenient when you're spending months in wilderness with limited food options. They'd write home about this theological gift, and European scholars would nod sagely and confirm yes. Beaver is definitely fish, enjoy your rodent. You examine your portion of tail. It's been roasted until the scaly skin crisped up, and beneath that lies a thick layer of fat beaver tails, are basically fat storage organs, evolution's way of helping the animal survive winter. The fat has rendered during cooking leaven meat that's surprisingly tender, almost gelatinous. It smells rich, oily, with a faint musky undertone that's distinctly mammalian. The first bite confirms what your nose suggested. This is not fish. This is fatty, rich, intensely flavoured meat that tastes like a cross between pork and something wild you can't quite name. The fat coats your mouth, clinging to your teeth and tongue. The texture is unusual, soft, almost melting, with that gelatinous quality from all the collagen. Medieval cooks typically served it with mustard or horseradish sharp flavours to cut through the overwhelming richness. Historians still argue whether medieval diners genuinely believed beaver tail was fish, or just enjoyed the convenient excuse to eat meat on Fridays. Letters and diaries from the period are maddeningly vague. People mention eating beaver during Lent without commentary, as if it's perfectly normal. Either they truly accepted the fish classification, or they were collectively winking at each other across centuries. The practice had economic implications beyond dinner plates. Monasteries near beaver habitats could trap and sell the tails as premium fasting food. A good beaver tail might fetch prices comparable to quality fish, sometimes higher. Account books show monasteries purchasing beaver tails for special feast days during Lent. Yes, feast days during fasting periods, because medieval Christianity loved its contradictions. You couldn't eat chicken, but you could absolutely gorge on beaver tail, and somehow that was more spiritually appropriate. Native Americans watching European trappers declare beaver fish must have been deeply confused. Indigenous peoples had been eating beaver for millennia without theological complications, treating it as what it obviously was, a large aquatic rodent with delicious fatty meat. The idea that you needed religious permission or taxonomic creativity to eat it probably seemed absurd. But Europeans brought their categorical anxieties with them, needing everything to fit into neat spiritual boxes. The beaver as fish ruling extended to other semi-aquatic creatures too. Muskrats fish, water voles fish. Basically, if it got wet regularly and looked vaguely unusual, some theologian somewhere would classify it as acceptable for Lent. The whole system reveals how desperately people wanted to eat meat, while technically following religious law, and how willing church authorities were to accommodate that desire through creative interpretation. By the 18th century, this particular fiction was crumbling. Better zoological knowledge made the mammal-fish distinction harder to ignore. Protestant mockery didn't help reformers loved pointing out Catholic logical pretzels like beaverfish as examples of corruption and absurdity. And frankly, as food became more abundant and varied, the desperate need to reclassify rodents as seafood diminished. People could just eat actual fish during Lent, imagine that. Today eating beaver tail is rare but not unheard of. Some indigenous communities maintain traditional preparation methods. A few adventurous chefs experiment with it as a novelty protein, and every so often someone discovers the medieval beaverfish connection and writes an amused article about historical theological flexibility. You finish your portion feeling the fat settle heavily in your already overloaded stomach. The beaver tail sits there like a greasy anchor, and you're starting to wonder if medieval banquet attendees just accepted chronic indigestion as part of the aristocratic lifestyle. Around you, nobles are slowing down too, faces showing the first signs of food exhaustion. But the meal isn't over. It's never over. There are more courses coming, more creative classifications, more animals that died so you could demonstrate your wealth through consumption. The beaver tail's grease is still coating your mouth when the next platter arrives, and honestly, you're almost grateful. After all that rich land and water meat, seeing actual seafood feels like a return to normalcy. Except this isn't your familiar modern seafood. This is seal dark, dense slabs of it, and next to that a pile of small roasted birds with distinctive colourful beaks. Puffins. The adorable clownbirds of the North Atlantic served with their beaks still attached like some kind of fever dream, both completely acceptable for Lent naturally. Because they live near or in the ocean, and medieval logic says that makes them fish-adjacent enough for fasting purposes. Let's start with seal, because at least that follows the same water-dwelling loophole we've been dancing around all evening. Seals are marine mammals. They swim, they eat fish, they spend most of their lives in cold ocean water. By the expansive definition medieval theologians applied, they qualified as fish for fasting purposes. Monks in coastal regions, particularly in Scotland, Ireland and Scandinavia, hunted seals regularly. The meat-fed communities through long Lenten periods, when other protein sources were forbidden. Seal meat is intensely dark, almost black when raw cooking, to a deep burgundy that looks more like liver than any fish you've ever seen. That colour comes from myoglobin seals dive deep and stay under for extended periods, requiring muscles packed with oxygen-carrying proteins. You're essentially eating the meat of an aquatic athlete, and it tastes like it. The flavour is powerful. Imagine if beef and fish had a baby, then that baby spent its entire life eating nothing but oily fish in freezing water. There's a marine quality, yes, but underneath is something distinctly mammalian, rich and iron-heavy. Medieval cooks tried to manage this intensity with aggressive seasoning, lots of pepper, ginger, garlic, anything to soften the wildness. Some recipes suggest soaking seal meat in milk or wine overnight before cooking, attempting to draw out the strong flavours. Your portion sits before you, cross-hatched from the roasting rack, glistening with fat. You take a bite. It's chewy, not tough exactly, but dense, requiring real jaw work. The taste hits immediately ocean iron, something primal and a bit unsettling. Even through the spices, you can taste exactly what this animal was, what it ate, where it lived. It's not unpleasant, but it's not exactly pleasant either. It's honest, maybe too honest for a society that usually preferred its food heavily disguised. Historians still argue whether coastal communities actually enjoyed seal meat or just ate it out of necessity. Records suggest both. Some accounts describe seal as valuable protein during difficult times. Winter storms failed fishing seasons, periods when other food ran scarce. Other documents mention seal being purchased deliberately for Lenten feasts, suggesting at least some people sought it out. The truth probably varied by region and personal taste, like most foods. The seal hunt itself was dangerous work. These aren't docile animals. Adult seals can weigh 300 pounds, have sharp teeth, and don't appreciate being clubbed on remote beaches. Hunting them required skill timing and a certain disregard for personal safety. Monasteries sometimes hired professional seal hunters, paying them in coin or portions of the catch. The fat alone seal blubber rendered into oil made the hunt worthwhile, even if the meat proved too strong for some palates. Now puffins, those impossibly cute seabirds with rainbow beaks and penguin-like waddles. Medieval Christians, particularly in Iceland, the Faroe Islands and coastal Scotland, ate them by the thousands during Lent. The logic was airtight by medieval standards. Puffins nest on sea cliffs, eat fish exclusively, and smell distinctly fishy. Obviously they're fish. Some clerics even classified them alongside actual fish in dietary guidelines, creating taxonomies that would make modern biologists weep. The preparation was straightforward, usually roasted or boiled, often with their feathers simply singed off rather than plucked. You'd eat them whole or nearly whole, working round the bones with your fingers. The meat is dark, oily, and tastes exactly like what the bird ate: fish. Intensely fishy. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to eat a bird-shaped anchovy puffin, is your answer. Some communities salted and dried puffins, creating preserved meat that could last months. Icelandic sources describe barrels of salted puffins stored for winter alongside dried fish and fermented shark. The bird's oiliness actually helped preservation. The fat acted as a barrier against spoilage. You'd soak the dried puffin in water before cooking, rehydrating it into something theoretically edible, though historical accounts suggest it remained pretty challenging even after soaking. Your puffin portion is small, these aren't large birds, and the colourful beak has been left attached either as decoration or because removing it seemed like unnecessary work. You avoid looking at it too directly while you nibble the breast meat. It's exactly as fishy as promised, with an oily richness that coats your mouth. The texture is similar to duck, dark, dense, with that distinctive waterbird quality. Between the seal and the puffin, your palate is now thoroughly marinated in ocean flavours. The fascinating part is how these practices persisted. Long after other medieval food oddities faded, coastal communities kept eating seal and puffin. Iceland still has traditional dishes featuring both. The Faroe Islands consider puffin a delicacy. These weren't just medieval affectations, they were genuine food traditions that continued because they worked, because the animals were available, because the meat, however challenging, provided real nutrition in harsh climates. The church eventually clarified its stance. Yes, seals and puffins are technically mammals and birds respectively, but historical exception allows their consumption during fasting in regions where they're traditional foods. A rare moment of theological flexibility meeting practical reality. You push away the remaining puffin, unable to face more fish bird. The seal at least had substance, something to chew. But these ocean-flavoured courses are starting to blur together into one long, salty endurance test. Your medieval stomach more accustomed to this than your modern sensibilities soldiers on. There's still more to come. There's always more to come. The seal and puffin have left your mouth tasting like low tide when the next course arrives, and this time you almost laugh. Almost. Because laughing at a noble's table when food is presented would be social suicide, even if what you're looking at is genuinely absurd. A large platter holds dozens, maybe hundreds of tiny roasted birds, each no bigger than your thumb. Larks, thrushes, ortolans if you're particularly unlucky. Songbirds, basically. The things that wake you at dawn with cheerful melodies now roasted whole and piled like grotesque popcorn. Medieval Europeans ate songbirds the way modern people eat chicken wings, enthusiastically, messily, in quantities that seem excessive in retrospect. And I do mean whole. You didn't carve these delicate creatures or pick the meat off politely. You grabbed one, popped the entire bird in your mouth, head bones, organs, everything, and crunched down. The bones were small enough to chew and swallow. The entire bird became food, a single, crunchy, fatty, disturbingly complete bite. This wasn't poverty eating either. Songbirds were considered delicacies, the kind of thing served at banquets to demonstrate both wealth and refined taste. Catching them required effort nets strung between trees' lime-covered branches that trapped them, sometimes trained birds of prey to flush them into traps. A single meal might require dozens of birds, which meant hours of hunting and preparation. Lords would send servants into forests specifically to trap songbirds for upcoming feasts. Larks were probably the most common. These small ground-dwelling birds were everywhere in medieval Europe, their distinctive songs marking dawn and dusk. Roasted, they had a delicate flavour, mild, slightly gamey, with the distinctive taste of whatever seeds and insects they'd been eating. The French particularly loved larks, developing elaborate recipes involving wrapping them in grape leaves or bacon before roasting. But even simple preparation, just salt, maybe some herbs, was considered acceptable. Thrushes offered more robust flavour. These slightly larger songbirds ate berries, giving their meat a subtle sweetness that medieval diners prized. Some recipes suggest roasting thrushes with juniper berries, creating a flavour profile that played on what the birds naturally consumed. Others simply roasted them on small spits dozens at a time until the skin crisped and the tiny bodies rendered their fat. But ortolans, oh ortolans, these tiny buntings became legendary, especially in France, for the ritualistic way they were consumed. The practice continued well past the medieval period into the 20th century, actually, but the roots are medieval. You'd catch an ortolan, fatten it in darkness, like those dormice. Everything gets fattened in darkness, then drown it in armagnac, then roast it, then eat it whole, traditionally with a napkin draped over your head to trap the aromas, though some suggest it was actually to hide your shame from God while you committed this particular culinary sin. The taste by all accounts was extraordinary. The fat from overfeeding the brandy-soaked flesh, the organs bursting as you chewed it, created a flavour experience that diners described as almost transcendent. Modern accounts from before the practice was banned describe it as tasting like the forest floor and the sky at once, which is either poetic or pretentious depending on your tolerance for food writing. Your platter holds the more common variety larks, probably based on size. They're golden brown, crisped in the fire, still recognisable as birds despite the roasting. You can see tiny beaks closed, eyes, feet curled in death. It's harder to dissociate this food from its source than the larger animals. That peacock at least got transformed into spectacle. These little birds just look like dead birds. You pick one up. It's still warm, small enough to fit entirely in your palm. The smell is pleasant, honestly roasted meat herbs, a slight sweetness. You do what medieval diners did. You place the entire bird in your mouth and bite down. The experience is immediate and intense. First comes the crispy skin, then the burst of fat and organ, then the crunch of tiny bones breaking between your teeth. The flavour is rich, concentrated, everything. The bird was condensed into one mouthful. You chew carefully, feeling small bones fragment, then swallow it all. It's not terrible. It's actually kind of good in a primal, slightly disturbing way. But the psychological weight of eating an entire vertebrate in one bite that takes adjustment. Historians still argue about the ethics of songbird consumption, even looking backward. These weren't domesticated food animals. They were wild creatures, many of them migratory, caught during vulnerable periods. Some medieval sources suggest awareness of this, records of communities voluntarily limiting songbird hunting during nesting season, trying to ensure future populations. Other records show no such restraint, just intensive harvesting that must have impacted local bird numbers. By the Renaissance, some regions were passing laws protecting certain songbird species, recognizing that unlimited hunting would eventually eliminate them. But enforcement was spotty and the practice continued. Italy particularly held on to songbird eating, developing regional dishes that persisted into modern times. Polenta e osse polenta, with small birds, remained traditional in northern Italy well into the 20th century. Today, most songbird hunting is illegal across Europe, protected under various conservation treaties. Ortolan consumption in France, once a mark of sophisticated dining, can result in serious fines. The birds sing safely, mostly, though poaching still happens in some regions where traditional attitudes persist. You reach for another lark, then reconsider. The first one was experience enough. Around you, nobles are picking through the pile with varying enthusiasm, some popping birds like candy, others nibbling more cautiously. The platter slowly empties dozens of small lives converted to aristocratic entertainment. Your trencher beneath everything is beyond salvaged, now completely saturated with drippings from a dozen different animals, some that flew, some that swam, some that merely existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. Soon someone will carry it away and you'll get fresh bread to catch the drippings from whatever comes next. Because yes, there's more coming. Of course there is. Medieval banquets don't acknowledge human limits. You're still processing the textural memory of tiny bird bones when the servants bring out something that makes several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. This isn't whole animals reconstructed for show. This isn't even recognizable cuts of meat. What arrives on the platter looks disturbingly unformed, pale glistening, almost translucent in the candlelight. Someone murmurs the explanation you are dreading calf fetus, and beside it equally unsettling lamb fetus. Unborn animals removed from their mothers and prepared as delicacies. Welcome to one of medieval cuisine's genuinely uncomfortable territories. Let me be clear about the context because it matters. These weren't intentionally bred for fetal consumption. That would be economically insane and wasteful, even by medieval standards. These came from animals slaughtered while pregnant, usually without knowledge of the pregnancy, until butchering revealed it. Once you've got a pregnant cow or sheep opened up, and there's a fetus inside medieval practicality asked, waste it or eat it. They chose eat it. Waste not want. Not even when not is an unborn calf. But here's where it gets complicated. Some medieval diners considered fetal meat a delicacy specifically because of its unusual qualities. The flesh was incredibly tender. No muscles had worked. No connective tissue had toughened through use. It was pale, almost white, with a delicate flavour that some compared to the finest veal. Texture-wise, it was almost custard-like in places, requiring barely any chewing. For people accustomed to tough, overworked meat from adult animals, this represented the ultimate in tenderness. The church had opinions naturally. Some theologians argued that fetuses never having breathed air weren't fully meat in the spiritual sense. Others insisted they absolutely were meat and should be treated accordingly during fasting periods. A few creative thinkers tried to classify them alongside eggs potential animals rather than actual animals, which would make them acceptable during certain fasts. The debate never fully resolved, creating regional variations in what was permissible. Preparation methods tried to dignify what was inherently a difficult ingredient to present. Calf fetus might be gently poached in milk and herbs, playing up its delicacy. Lamb fetus could be wrapped in cool fat, the lacy membrane surrounding organs, and roasted carefully to avoid toughening the tender flesh. Some recipes suggest preparing it like sweetbreads, with rich sauces to add substance to the delicate meat. Your portion sits before you, and honestly you're not sure you can do this. It's one thing to eat whole animals, even cute ones. It's another to eat something that never had a chance to become whole. The piece is small. These are tiny creatures, pale and glistening with whatever it was poached in. The smell is mild, almost neutral, with just a hint of milk and herbs. You take a bite because refusing would cause more awkwardness than consuming. The texture is exactly as unsettling as you feared, soft, almost melting, with no resistance whatsoever. The flavour is delicate, barely there, vaguely reminiscent of very mild veal, but somehow emptier, less defined. It's not unpleasant exactly. It's just profoundly weird, your brain struggling to categorise what you're eating, while your mouth processes something that feels more like pâté than meat. Historians still argue whether this was genuinely prized or just pragmatically consumed. Some medieval sources praise the tenderness, suggesting real appreciation. Others mention it matter-of-factly alongside other organ meats, implying it was just another byproduct of butchering. The truth probably varied by region, class, and personal taste. Some diners genuinely enjoyed the delicacy. Others ate it because it was there, and wasting food was considered sinful. There's also an interesting gender dimension. Pregnant animals were valuable. They represented future livestock, future wealth. Slaughtering them was generally avoided when possible, So the appearance of fetal meat at table often signalled either accident necessity or deliberate luxury. A lord serving it might be saying, "I'm so wealthy I can afford to waste future animals," which is perhaps the most medieval flex imaginable. The practice had practical limits. Fetuses from late pregnancy were more likely to be kept and raised. If the mother died, they could sometimes survive with hand feeding. Very early pregnancies might not even be noticed during butchering. The sweet spot for fetal meat was middle pregnancy, when the fetus was developed enough to have substance, but not viable enough to save. This created a narrow window that made the practice relatively rare compared to other unusual meats. Different cultures had different tolerances. Mediterranean regions seemed more comfortable with it, incorporating fetal lamb into traditional dishes that persisted in some areas into modern times. Northern Europe was more ambivalent, eating it when it appeared, but not seeking it out. England had mixed attitudes, with some cookbooks including recipes, while others pointedly ignored the practice. By the early modern period, sensibilities were shifting. Growing squeamishness about food sources combined with improved animal husbandry that better identified pregnancies before slaughter made fetal meat increasingly rare. It never fully disappeared from some regional cuisines, but it stopped being something you'd serve at high-status banquets. The discomfort we feel today about it was beginning to emerge, that sense that some things cross lines even in meat-eating cultures. You finish your small portion mostly out of obligation. Around the table, reactions range from enthusiastic to barely concealed discomfort. This is one of those courses where medieval and modern sensibilities clash most sharply. Medieval pragmatism saw tender meat and opportunity. Modern minds see something that never got to live, and the distinction matters in ways that transcend mere taste. The servants clear the plates quickly, perhaps sensing the room's unease. Even in an era of extreme meat consumption, this pushed boundaries. Not everyone's boundaries, but enough that it created tension. The meal moves forward because it always moves forward, but there's a subtle shift in energy, a collective desire to move past this particular course into something less philosophically complicated. Your stomach, meanwhile, is staging a quiet rebellion. The sheer variety, mammal, bird, fish that isn't fish, mammals that are fish, whole songbirds, and now this is overwhelming your digestive system in ways that no single food could. Medieval nobles developed iron stomachs through practice, but you're a novice, and it shows. You sip wine watered, spiced warm, trying to settle things. The night is far from over. There are still courses coming, still more animals that died, so you could demonstrate your status through consumption. You're still recovering from the psychological weight of the last course when actual laughter erupts from the far end of the table. Not polite chuckles, real, delighted laughter. The kind that makes you crane your neck to see what's causing such reaction at a formal banquet. And then you see it, and your brain briefly short-circuits, trying to process what your eyes are reporting. It's a pig. No, wait, it's a chicken. Actually, it's both. Simultaneously. Impossibly. The front half is clearly poultry wings. Chicken breast, a bird's neck. But where the bird should end, pig begins. Pork hindquarters are curled tail trotters. Someone has sewn two different animals together into one nightmarish chimera and roasted it, as if this were perfectly normal. Welcome to the cockentrice, or sometimes cockagrees. Medieval cooks' idea of a joker display of technical skill and a conversation piece all sewn together with butcher's twine. The creation process was exactly as disturbing as you'd imagine. Take a pig butcher, it keep the back half. Take a chicken or capon if you're fancy, butcher it, keep the front half. Carefully sew them together along the cut line, matching the proportions as best you can. Stuff the cavity with breadcrumbs, herbs, and whatever else you'd normally put in a roast. Then cook the whole unholy creation, basting it carefully, because you're dealing with two different meats that cook at different rates. What emerges is something that should not exist, but somehow does, a culinary Frankenstein that medieval diners apparently found hilarious. And they did find it hilarious. Records describe guests laughing, making jokes, pointing out the absurdity. The cockentrice wasn't trying to fool anyone. It was obvious parody food as entertainment, a literal joke that happened to be edible. It appeared at banquets specifically to provoke reaction, to show that the host had both humour and a kitchen staff skilled enough to pull off something this technically difficult. Because make no mistake, this required skill. Sewing two carcasses together, cleanly ensuring they'd hold together during roasting, managing different cooking times for pork and poultry, this wasn't beginner work. Some recipes suggest par-cooking the pork first, giving it a head start before attaching the chicken, trying to get both meats properly done simultaneously. Others recommend roasting it slowly, monitoring, constantly accepting that one half might be slightly overdone while the other reaches safety. The name itself has contested origins. Cockentrice might derive from cockatrice, the mythical serpent rooster creature that could kill with a glance, or it might just be a portmanteau of cock and some variation of pork. Historians still argue etymology while agreeing that regardless of name origin, the dish was intentionally absurd. Your portion arrives, you get a slice that includes both meats, a cross-section, revealing the internal stuffing and the seam where pig met poultry. The chicken side is properly roasted, golden skinned, looking mostly normal if you ignore context. The pork side is darker, crisper, definitely pork, and in between the place where they joined there's a visible line, a culinary scar where two animals became one. You taste the chicken first. It's fine, well-cooked, herbed, exactly what you'd expect from roasted poultry. Then the pork, also fine, fatty and rich, standard medieval pork preparation. The stuffing in between has absorbed flavours from both meats, creating something oddly harmonious, despite the absurd presentation. Separately, each component is perfectly edible. Together they form something that makes you question medieval priorities. But that's exactly the point. The cockentrice existed to make you question, to provoke conversation, to demonstrate that food could be playful. In a culture where food was serious business theology status, survival, having a dish that was purely entertainment, represented luxury in its own way. You had so much food security, so much kitchen capacity, that you could waste time and resources on jokes. Variations existed. Some cooks created helmeted cocks, roosters dressed in tiny armour made from pastry. Others made boar's head with peacock tail, sewing elaborate plumage onto pig faces. The medieval kitchen, given resources and encouragement, could create absolute chaos. Some banquets featured multiple absurd hybrid creatures, a whole menagerie of impossible animals parading past guests who'd eaten and drunk enough to find it all hysterically funny. There's something almost modern about it, honestly. We make to duck and turkey, stuffed with duck, stuffed with chicken. We create over-the-top fusion dishes for Instagram. Medieval nobles made cockentrice ears and laughed at their own excess. The impulse to make food weird and entertaining isn't new. We've just changed the specific forms of weird. Not everyone appreciated the humour. Some religious authorities grumbled that mocking God's creation by sewing animals together showed dangerous pride. A few medical texts warned that combining different meats could create digestive chaos, which fair point given everything else you've eaten tonight. But the practice persisted for centuries, appearing in cookbooks from England to Italy, each region adding its own variations. The decline came gradually. As Renaissance aesthetics favoured elegance over absurdity, the cockentrice started seeming less sophisticated and more barbaric. By the 17th century it had mostly vanished from high-status tables, though it lingered in some regional traditions as a festival dish. Today it occasionally appears at medieval reenactments or historical cooking demonstrations, usually prompting the same mixture of laughter and horror it provoked centuries ago. You finish your slice feeling slightly ridiculous for eating something that was sewn together as a prank. Around you, the initial laughter has died down, but people are still smiling, still commenting on the absurdity. The cockentrice succeeded in its mission it entertained. In a meal of dead animals, this particular combination of dead animals managed to be funny. Your stomach, now containing representatives from multiple species sewn together, continues its quiet protest. The wine helps cutting through the fat, settling things somewhat. You're past the halfway point of this banquet now, deep into the evening, and your medieval body is adapting to the relentless parade of protein and fat. Your modern mind, though, is still struggling with the sheer weirdness of everything that's happened so far. And there's more coming. There's always more coming. The cockentrice is being cleared away, servants grinning at each other over the absurdity of it, when the next course arrives with significantly less fanfare. No elaborate presentation this time, no reconstructed plumage or architectural absurdity. Just a large, dark, slightly lumpy sausage sliced into thick rounds that glisten wetly in the candlelight. The smell hits you immediately, iron spices, something primal and a bit unsettling. Blood pudding, or blood sausage, or black pudding depending on your region. Congealed animal blood mixed with fat oats or barley, and enough spices to make it palatable, all stuffed into intestinal casings and cooked until solid. It looks exactly like what it is, which is somehow both honest and disturbing. Here's the thing about blood pudding in most food cultures: it was peasant food. Poor food. The kind of thing you made because you couldn't afford to waste anything when you slaughtered an animal. Blood was free, protein fat trimmings were free calories, and intestines made free casings. Mix them together with whatever grain you had lying around, and you'd created a calorie-dense food that could feed a family for days. Nothing fancy, just survival. But medieval Europe, in its infinite capacity for social complexity, somehow elevated blood pudding to occasional delicacy status. Not everywhere, not consistently, but enough that it appeared at noble tables alongside lamprey and swan. The reasoning seemed to be that anything prepared well enough transcended its humble origins. Blood pudding made with premium pig's blood, expensive spices, and careful technique became something you could serve to guests without embarrassment. The spicing made all the difference. Peasant blood pudding might just have salt and maybe some onion. Noble blood pudding got the full treatment: pepper, expensive; cinnamon, very expensive; cloves, nutmeg, ginger. Some recipes included currants or raisins for sweetness, creating a sweet savoury profile that was distinctly medieval. The best versions used fresh blood still warm from slaughter, mixed immediately with fat and spices before it could coagulate improperly. Your slice sits before you, dark as night, studded with visible bits of fat and the occasional pale grain of barley. The texture looks dense, almost cake-like, nothing fluid remaining. Medieval blood pudding was cooked thoroughly, either boiled in its casing or sometimes sliced and fried afterward. No one was serving rare blood dishes. The goal was solid, sliceable, something that could sit at room temperature for hours during a long banquet without becoming health hazard. You cut a piece. It's firm, holding together well, the fat creating a slight sheen on the cut surface. The smell intensifies iron, definitely that unmistakable blood smell, but softened by cinnamon and cloves. You take a bite. The texture is grainy from the barley, creamy from the fat held together by the cooked blood protein. The taste is rich, intensely savoury with that mineral quality that announces exactly what this is. The spices help warming aromatic, trying to civilise something fundamentally uncivilised. It's not bad. That's the surprising part. If you can get past the knowledge of what you're eating, the actual eating experience is fine, hearty, filling, the kind of food that sticks to your ribs and keeps you warm on cold days. Medieval Europeans understood this instinctively. Blood pudding appeared at winter feasts, at celebrations following animal slaughter, at times when maximum calories were desired. The church generally approved of blood pudding during non-fasting periods, though some theologians got weird about it. Biblical prohibitions against consuming blood made a few authorities uncomfortable, but most regions decided that since the blood was cooked and mixed with other ingredients, it had been sufficiently transformed to be acceptable. Another convenient interpretation when people wanted to eat something. Different regions developed distinctive versions. English black pudding leaned heavily on oats and onions. French boudin noir included apples and cream. Spanish morcilla added rice and paprika. German blutwurst was coarser, chunkier, more aggressively seasoned. Each region took the same basic concept blood-fat filler and created something uniquely theirs. These weren't separate medieval inventions. Blood sausage had been around since ancient times, appearing in Roman cookbooks and probably long before that. What's interesting is how blood pudding's status varied even within the same meal. Serve it at the beginning, and its rustic peasanty may be a knowing nod to humble origins. Serve it late in the banquet after all the fancy birds and reconstructed animals, and it becomes a palate cleanser, a return to honest food after hours of performance. Context changed everything. Some medieval medical texts praised blood pudding for its strengthening properties. The doctrine of humours suggested that blood-built blood eating it would increase your own blood's vitality. Anemic people, or those recovering from illness, were sometimes prescribed blood pudding as medicine. Whether it actually helped is questionable, but the iron content probably didn't hurt. Preparation was time-sensitive and slightly dangerous. Blood clots quickly, so you had to work fast after slaughter, stirring constantly to prevent premature coagulation. Add the fat too early and it wouldn't emulsify properly. Add the spices too late and they wouldn't distribute evenly. Cook it too hot, and the casing would burst, spilling bloody mixture into your pot. Getting it right required experience and attention. Modern blood pudding still exists across Europe, breakfast staple in some places, artisanal delicacy in others. It's experienced various revivals, nose-to-tail eating movements, traditional food preservation sustainability initiatives. Chefs rediscover that using the whole animal, including blood, makes economic and environmental sense, which is exactly what medieval peasants knew all along before anyone called it sustainability. You finish your slice surprised that you managed it without hesitation. The blood pudding is grounding somehow after all the exotic animals and absurd presentations. This is just food efficient, practical, honest, about being blood and fat and grain. No pretense, no reconstruction, just calories in a casing. Around you, nobles are eating without comment. Blood pudding doesn't provoke the same reactions as cockentrice or songbirds. It's too familiar, too ordinary, despite appearing at a fancy banquet. Everyone here has probably eaten blood pudding since childhood, whether they admit it or not. It crosses class lines in ways most medieval foods didn't. Your stomach accepts it more easily than much of what came before, maybe because it's less rich, less aggressively fatty, or maybe because your digestive system recognizes something honest after hours of culinary performance art. Either way, you're grateful for the respite. You sip your wine, feel the warmth, and prepare for whatever comes next. The servants are already moving in the kitchen doorway. The blood pudding's iron aftertaste is still lingering when the next dish arrives, and this one comes with an explanation you didn't ask for but definitely needed. The servant leans close and whispers, "Humble pie, my lord, from the deer taken at yesterday's hunt." You nod like you understand, like this is completely normal information, while your brain frantically tries to decode what umbles might be. Organs, umbles are organs. Specifically the humble parts of the deer heart, liver, kidneys, tongue, sometimes brains, the bits considered less prestigious than the prime cuts. The stuff that couldn't be served as venison proper but was too valuable to waste. So they got chopped up, mixed with suet and spices, wrapped in pastry and baked into pie. And depending on where you sat at the table, you either got this or you got the actual venison roast. Guess which one signalled your importance? This is where we get the phrase eating humble pie, though the etymology is messier than that. Umbles probably came from numbles, which derive from Latin lumbulus, meaning loin. But somewhere along the way, humble and umble got confused or deliberately merged, and suddenly eating the organ pie became associated with social humiliation. Served humble pie. You're not important enough for the good cuts. Accept your organs and your lower status simultaneously. But here's the complexity. Humble pie wasn't necessarily bad. In fact, when made properly with fresh organs and quality spicing, it could be delicious. The organs were rich, intensely flavoured, nutritionally dense. The suet kept everything moist. The pastry absorbed all those meaty juices, becoming something transcendent. A well-made humble pie represented serious cooking skill, transforming lesser ingredients into something worthy of any table. The medieval class system, though, couldn't let that stand. If humble pie was good, it needed to be designated as not for us, by the upper classes, reserved for servants' lower tables, the people who didn't merit prime cuts. This wasn't about taste, it was about maintaining hierarchy through food. You are what you eat, and if you're eating organs while your betters eat muscle meat, everyone knows exactly where you stand. Your slice of pie arrives a generous wedge with dark filling visible through breaks in the pastry. The crust is thick, sturdy. These weren't delicate French pastries, but functional vessels designed to contain liquid and withstand hours at room temperature. The smell is rich, meaty, with strong herbal notes. Sage, probably. Maybe thyme. Lots of pepper. You cut through the crust, it resists requiring real knife work, and reveal the filling. It's dark, glossy chunks of various organs suspended in congealed fat and juice. You can identify heart muscle dense and dark, liver softer and paler, something that might be kidney with that distinctive texture. All of it mingled together, bound by suet and spices into something that's somehow more than the sum of its parts. The first bite is a texture adventure. The crust is thick and chewy, more bread than pastry, soaked through with meaty juices. Then comes the filling, a complex mixture of textures as different organs each contribute their own quality. Heart is chewy, muscular. Liver is soft, almost creamy, with that distinctive mineral intensity. Kidney adds a slight funk and edge that the spices work to soften. The suet binds it all together with rich, fatty smoothness. The taste is powerful. This is not subtle food. Every bite announces exactly what it is, animal organs barely disguised by spicing. But it's also somehow comforting, hearty, the kind of food that fills you completely. There's an honesty to humble pie that the fancy courses lacked. No reconstruction, no pretense. Just efficient use of an entire animal transformed through skill into something filling and warm. Historians still argue about exactly who ate humble pie in medieval households. Some sources suggest it was exclusively servant food, made from leftovers after nobles took their prime cuts. Others indicate it appeared at lower tables during banquets, while the high table got roasted haunches. A few records show humble pie being served to everyone's status determined by what else you got with it, not whether you got pie at all. The hunting connection was important. When a lord held a successful hunt deer boar, whatever the distribution of meat became a social ritual. The best cuts went to the hunter the noble host honoured guests. Good but lesser cuts went to family-important servants, skilled craftsmen. The organs, they got divided among everyone else, then made into pies that fed dozens of people. One deer could create social hierarchy in edible form, every person knowing exactly where they ranked, based on which part they received. Regional variations existed. Some areas made humble pie with added fruits, apples, prunes, creating sweet savoury combinations that medieval palates loved. Others kept it purely savoury, doubling down on the organ meatiness. Coastal regions sometimes made fish humble pie, though that seems like a contradiction. Fish don't have the same organ complexity. But the concept of lesser parts transformed into pie, translated across protein sources. The pastry itself served multiple functions. Obviously it contained the filling, but in an era before plates were universal, the crust also was your plate. A trencher basically, but individualized. You'd eat the filling, then eat the gravy-soaked pastry beneath. Nothing wasted. Even the bottom crust, too tough to chew comfortably, might go to dogs or poor people waiting outside. The entire pie participated in cascading economies of food distribution. By the Tudor period, humble pie was firmly associated with a lower status, its reputation cemented. Even as cooking improved and the pies got better, the social stigma stuck. Saying someone ate humble pie became an insult, a way of pointing out someone's diminished circumstances or forcing them to acknowledge error. The food became metaphor, the metaphor outlasting the food. You finish your sliced stomach now, containing both premium meats and organ mixture, the full spectrum of the deer that died yesterday. The humble pie sits heavier than much of what came before, its dense filling designed to sustain rather than impress. Around you, reactions vary based on where people sit, what else they've eaten, how they perceive their own status. Some eat heartily, others pick reluctantly, performing their place in the hierarchy through eating. You're starting to feel genuinely full, not comfortably satisfied, but that medieval fullness where your stomach is actively protesting, and your brain is wondering if this is how nobility just lived in a constant state of overconsumption. And then the servants bring out something that makes the entire room gasp. Not because of what it is, but because of what it looks like. It's a roasted boar's head, or maybe a peacock, or wait, is that a castle? You can't quite tell because the entire thing is covered in gold. Not gold-coloured, not golden brown from roasting. Actual gold. Thin sheets of it glimmering in the candlelight, coating every surface of the dish, until the food underneath becomes almost secondary to the metallic sheen. Welcome to gilding medieval cuisine's most literal interpretation of conspicuous consumption, because apparently serving rare animals reconstructed in their own plumage wasn't quite enough. Someone decided that food needed to be covered in precious metals to truly communicate wealth, and not just a light dusting, we're talking full coverage sheets of gold leaf carefully applied to create an entirely golden dish. The gold itself was real. Thin beaten gold leaf, the same stuff used in manuscript illumination and church decoration applied to food with egg white or other adhesives. It was edible gold passes through the human digestive system completely unchanged, which means yes, you literally pooped out gold the next day. The ultimate in wasteful consumption, eating something that provided zero nutritional value and couldn't even be digested purely to prove you could afford to. The practice wasn't universal. This was top-tier noble feasting, the kind of thing that appeared at royal weddings, treaty celebrations, coronations. Events where the guest list included people who needed to be impressed or intimidated through extravagant display. A gilded peacock said, "I am so wealthy that I can literally eat money and it means nothing to me," which, let's be honest, is perhaps the most aggressive flex in human history. But it wasn't just gold. Silverleaf appeared too, creating metallic landscapes on food surfaces. Some dishes got both gold here, silver there, creating patterns or heraldic symbols. A few truly excessive displays incorporated coloured glazes under the metal, so when light hit it right, you'd see rainbows through the gold. Medieval Instagram would have lost its mind. The application required real skill. Gold leaf is incredibly delicate, breathe wrong, and it tears or flies away. You had to work carefully, applying adhesive, usually egg white, beaten to stiffness, then laying the gold sheet smoothly without wrinkles or gaps. For complex shapes like that reconstructed peacock from earlier, you'd need multiple artisans working together, covering feathers and curves without damaging the underlying roasted meat. Hours of work, enormous expense, all for something that would be eaten, or more accurately consumed, as theatre in minutes. Your portion arrives and you're looking at gilded swan, a slice of that tough gamey bird you ate earlier, but this time with its skin preserved and covered in gold leaf. The metal has cracked slightly where the servant carved it, revealing the roasted meat underneath, but most of the surface still gleams. It looks completely surreal, like food from a fairy tale, where everything the king touches turns to gold except backwards, where gold turns back into food once you bite it. You cut into it carefully, the gold leaf fragments breaking into smaller pieces that cling to the meat. You take a bite, and the experience is bizarre. First, there's the psychological weirdness of eating metal. Your brain knows gold isn't food, shouldn't be in your mouth, but here it is anyway. Then there's the texture. The leaf is so thin it's almost imperceptible, just a slight metallic slickness against your tongue. The taste gold is essentially flavourless, so you're just tasting the swan underneath, that tough gamey meat you remember, but now with bonus metal in your teeth. The gold sticks to everything. Your teeth, your tongue, the roof of your mouth. Little flakes of it mix with the meat as you chew, creating occasional flashes of reflection in the candlelight when you open your mouth. You swallow, and somewhere in your digestive system, gold is now travelling alongside blood, pudding, humble pie organs, and pieces of numerous deceased animals. Your body will extract exactly 0 nutrients from the gold. It will emerge eventually unchanged, and undigested, the most expensive component of your stool. Historians still argue about the point of gilding beyond obvious wealth display. Some suggest it had pseudo-medical justifications. Medieval and ancient medicine sometimes prescribed gold for various ailments, believing it had purifying properties. Eating gilded food might have been seen as healthful, not just showy. Others point out that gold was associated with divinity, with heaven, with perfection. Covering food in gold elevated the meal to something quasi-sacred, transforming consumption into ritual. The practice had ancient roots. Romans gilded foods at elaborate feasts. Islamic courts in Spain continued the tradition, sometimes gilding entire banquet spreads. Medieval European nobles inherited and amplified it, turning it into competitive display. If your rival served gilded peacock at his daughter's wedding, you'd better serve gilded swan and gilded boar at yours, or accept social defeat. Not everyone approved. Some religious authorities grumbled about the vanity, the waste, the pride, implicit in covering God's provisions with human wealth symbols. A few moralists wrote screeds against gilding, calling it evidence of society's corruption. But the practice continued for centuries, only gradually fading, as Renaissance aesthetics favoured different forms of luxury. The economic absurdity is staggering when you calculate it. A single gilded peacock might use gold worth months of a peasant's wages. A fully gilded banquet spread multiple dishes, elaborate presentations could represent more wealth than entire villages saw in years. All of it eaten, pooped out and gone. The ultimate rejection of practical value in favour of pure status performance. Today, edible gold leaf still exists, used by fancy restaurants and high-end confectioners to add sparkle to desserts, but it's typically used sparingly, a small accent, not full coverage. We've mostly decided that completely coating food in precious metals is excessive even by luxury standards. Though cryptocurrency millionaires occasionally commission gold-covered steaks, proving that the impulse to eat wealth hasn't entirely disappeared, just found new forms. You finish your gilded swan feeling the last bits of gold leaf sliding down your throat. Your mouth still has metallic traces, little remnants of wealth clinging to your teeth. Around the table, nobles are examining their portions, commenting on the craftsmanship, the quality of the application. No one discusses taste, that's not the point. The point is sitting here eating gold and having that be normal. The gold leaf is still lodged between your molars when servants arrive carrying elaborate silver pitchers, pouring deep red liquid into everyone's cups with ceremonial attention. The smell reaches you before the liquid does wine, yes, but transformed. Loaded with spices so pungent they compete with all the meat smoke in the hall. This isn't the plain wine you've been drinking all evening to wash down the parade of animals. This is hippocras, the spiced wine that medieval nobility considered both sophisticated drink and legitimate medicine. Or maybe it's claret, the names blur and overlap depending on region and recipe. But the concept remains constant. Take wine, add expensive spices, sweeten it with honey or sugar, strain it multiple times, serve it with reverence. This is what separated noble drinking from peasant drinking. Anyone could drink wine. Only the wealthy could afford to turn wine into liquid gold, metaphorically. This time, though, after that gilded swan, who knows? The base wine was typically red, though white hippocras existed too. Quality varied. Some recipes insisted on the finest wines from specific regions. Others admitted that heavily spicing wine was a convenient way to rescue something that had started turning. Add enough cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and pepper, and you could mask a multitude of vinegar-ward tendencies, though truly wealthy households used premium wine regardless, because why do anything halfway when you could do it expensively? The spice list read like a merchant's fantasy. Cinnamon, ginger cloves, nutmeg, grains of paradise, a West African spice worth its weight in almost gold, sometimes cardamom, occasionally long pepper. Each spice represented significant expense. Some travelled thousands of miles via routes that passed through multiple middlemen, each taking their cut. A single batch of hippocras might contain more spice value than a craftsman's monthly wages. Sugar or honey provided sweetness, lots of it. Medieval palates loved sweet wine in ways that would horrify modern sommeliers. The sweetness balanced the spice heat, creating something that tasted like liquid Christmas, if Christmas were also slightly medicinal and aggressively expensive. Some recipes called for sugar amounts that seem absurd. A pound of sugar to a gallon of wine wasn't unusual. The result was almost syrupy, coating your mouth with sweetness and spice in equal measure. Your cup arrives filled with dark aromatic liquid. You raise it, and the smell intensifies. Cinnamon dominates, but underneath there's warmth from ginger, floral notes from cloves. Something mysterious that might be grains of paradise. You take a sip. It hits your tongue like a spice bomb wrapped in velvet. Sweet, intensely sweet, but also warm, tingling, complex. The wine itself is almost secondary, a vehicle for spice and sugar. The finish lingers, coating your mouth, warming your chest as you swallow. This is medicine according to medieval theory. The doctrine of humours held that spices were hot and dry, capable of balancing excess cold or moisture in the body. Hippocras could aid digestion, crucial after the meat parade you've just endured. It could warm you on cold nights. It could restore vitality, stimulate appetite, though who needs more appetite at this point, and generally promote health? Physicians prescribed it, medical text praised it, and conveniently it also tasted good and got you drunk, so everyone won. The preparation was elaborate. You couldn't just dump spices in wine and call it done. Proper Hippocras required multiple steps, grinding spices fresh, mixing them with wine and sweetener, letting the mixture steep for hours or overnight, then straining it through fine cloth bags multiple times until it ran clear and smooth. Some recipes called for straining through the Hippocrates sleeve, a specialized cone-shaped cloth filter that gave the drink its name, though this etymology is disputed among historians who still argue whether Hippocras came from Hippocrates or something else entirely. Serving Hippocras signalled specific moments in a meal. Sometimes it appeared at the beginning as an appetite stimulant and welcome drink. More often it came late after heavy courses, its digestive properties helping guests process the pounds of meat currently staging a revolt in their stomachs. It also appeared at the very end with final sweet courses, or during the void, a pause between major meal sections where guests would rest, perhaps move to another room, and consume Hippocras with spiced wafers. Regional variations flourished. English recipes tended toward heavier sweetness. French versions often included more grains of paradise and less sugar. Italian claret recipes sometimes add rosewater or orange peel, Mediterranean touches that Northern Europeans found exotic. Each household developed signature recipes, closely guarded proportions that supposedly made their Hippocras superior to everyone else's. The drink appeared in literature as shorthand for sophisticated living. Characters in medieval romances consumed Hippocras at key moments, celebrations, seductions, negotiations. Offering someone Hippocras demonstrated hospitality and status simultaneously. Refusing it could constitute an insult, suggesting their spiced wine wasn't good enough for you, which was fighting words in societies where honour meant everything. By the Renaissance, Hippocras was everywhere wealthy people gathered. Wedding feasts, guild banquets, university celebrations, diplomatic receptions. The drink crossed boundaries that food couldn't easier to transport than elaborate dishes, impressive without requiring reconstruction skills and genuinely pleasurable to drink regardless of status signalling. You take another sip feeling the warmth spread through your chest. The alcohol combines with spices to create a pleasant burning sensation like controlled fire sliding down your throat. Your overfull stomach actually does feel slightly better. Maybe the digestive properties weren't entirely fictional. Or maybe the alcohol is just numbing your awareness of gastrointestinal distress. Either way, it's working. Around the table, everyone's drinking with visible pleasure. This is the course that gets genuine enjoyment rather than performance. No one's pretending to like Hippocras, they actually do. After hours of eating increasingly bizarre animals, the spiced wine offers familiar comfort. Sweet, warm, reliable. Your cup empties faster than you intended. Servants circulate refilling from those silver pitchers. The wine flows freely now this late in the banquet. Social controls are loosening. Laughter increases. Conversations grow louder. The Hippocras is doing its job smoothing social interactions, warming spirits, making the excessive consumption seem reasonable and pleasant, rather than the endurance test it actually is. You accept a refill, grateful for something that isn't solid, isn't animal, isn't challenging your digestive system's capacity. Just warm, sweet, spiced liquid that tastes like luxury and makes you forget temporarily that your stomach contains gold leaf and organs and entire tiny birds. The night continues, the hippocras flows, and somewhere in your wine and spice-fogged mind, you understand why medieval nobles did this repeatedly. It's awful and excessive, and your body will hate you tomorrow. But right now, with hippocras warming you from within, it almost makes sense. The hippocras has softened the edges of reality when the next course arrives, and this time you genuinely can't tell if you're looking at food or architecture. Rising from an enormous platter is a structure tower's battlements, what appears to be a miniature castle complete with flags and windows all rendered in glistening white with touches of colour. It's too detailed to be food. It has to be a decoration, a centerpiece, something to admire but not consume. Except people are eating it. Servants are carving into the towers and pieces are being distributed. And suddenly you realize this entire edifice, this 3-foot-tall, architectural marvel is made from sugar marzipan and lard. It's called a subtlety, which is perhaps the most ironic name possible for something this aggressively elaborate. Medieval subtleties were anything but subtle. These were massive sugar sculptures, edible showpieces that appeared between courses to provoke awe conversation and renewed appetite through pure spectacle. They could represent castles, ships, mythological scenes, heraldic beasts, religious tableaux, anything the kitchen staff had skill and time to construct. The best ones incorporated moving parts, a mechanical bird that flapped wings, a ship with billowing cloth sails, a dragon that breathed actual fire, clove-studded and ignited, terrifying everyone. The construction process was insane. First you needed a structural framework, often wood or wire, since sugar alone couldn't support massive weight. Then you'd build up layers of marzipan ground, almonds and sugar paste, or sugar paste sculpting details by hand or with moulds. Colours came from natural dyes, saffron for yellow, spinach juice for green, sandalwood for red, crushed minerals for blues. Gold and silver leaf appeared here too, because of course it did. Some subtleties took days to construct, entire teams of specialized craftsmen working around the clock before a major feast. The one before you depicts a castle siege apparently. Tiny marzipan knights scale ladders towards sugar battlements, where other knights defend with weapons carved from hardened sugar. There's a catapult non-functional, sadly. Flags made from coloured marzipan, even tiny windows with what looks like rice paper panes. The detail is staggering. Someone spent probably 40 hours making edible warfare. Your portion arrives a piece of the castle wall, white and smooth, decorated with what appears to be painted stones. You examine it closely. The sugar paste is hard, almost ceramic in texture. You tap it with your knife and it sounds solid, almost like knocking on wood. This isn't soft candy. This is structural confectionery engineered to stand for hours without collapsing. You bite carefully and the sugar paste crunches between your teeth like crystallized honey. It's intensely sweet, almost overwhelmingly so, but there's a subtle almond flavor from marzipan mixed in. The texture is odd hard, then suddenly dissolving into graininess as your saliva breaks it down. It's not unpleasant, just strange. You're eating architecture. Your teeth are excavating a castle wall. The absurdity is perfect for this evening. Historians still argue about the point of subtleties beyond obvious display. Some suggest they served as conversation starters, giving guests something to discuss between courses. Others point out that sugar was believed to aid digestion, the medical texts again, so these sweet interludes had theoretical health benefits. And practically they signalled transitions in the meal, marking the end of one section and beginning of another. The subtlety was intermission made edible. The symbolism mattered enormously. A castle subtlety at a political banquet referenced territorial power. A ship's subtlety might celebrate a naval victory or trade success. Religious subtleties, crucifixion scenes, saints, biblical stories turned banquets into edible catechism. You weren't just eating sugar. You were consuming meaning, making political or spiritual statements literally digestible. Not all subtleties were sugar. Some used pastry, creating savoury sculptures that blurred the line between food and art. Enormous pies that, when cut, released live birds. Yes, really, the birds were placed in the baked shell afterward. Then it was sealed and presented. Pastry castles filled with different foods in each room. One famous subtlety featured a pie that contained an entire orchestra of musicians who emerged playing instruments when the crust was broken. The Middle Ages were weird, is what I'm saying. The sugar cost alone was staggering. Medieval sugar came from Arab traders or later Mediterranean sugar plantations. It was expensive, not quite gold expensive, but definitely luxury item expensive. Using pounds of it to build castles was an explicit wealth signal. I have so much sugar that I can build buildings with it, and then destroy them for entertainment. The message was clear. Marzipan had its own prestige. Almonds weren't cheap, and grinding them fine enough required significant labour. High-quality marzipan was smooth, pliable, could be moulded like clay, and held detail beautifully. Lower-quality versions were grainy, cracked easily, and tasted vaguely of effort rather than elegance. The marzipan in your castle piece is clearly premium smooth sweet, with that distinctive almond richness. By the Tudor period, subtleties reached peak absurdity. Henry VIII's banquets featured multiple elaborate sugar sculptures per meal. Chess sets you could play with, then eat entire gardens, with sugar flowers, fountains that ran with wine, not sugar, but incorporated into sugar landscapes. The competition among nobles to create the most impressive subtlety drove confectioners to increasingly complex designs. The decline came gradually. As sugar became more common and less expensive, it lost some prestige as display material. Chocolate's arrival from the New World offered new sculptural possibilities, and eventually Renaissance aesthetics decided that maybe having pastry chefs spend weeks building castles you'd destroy in minutes was excessive even by excessive standards. You finish your piece of castle wall feeling sugar crystals stuck to your teeth. The sweetness coats your mouth, almost medicinal in intensity. Around you, the subtlety is being systematically dismantled, the siege ending not in victory but in consumption. Towers fall to knives. Battlements crumble. The marzipan knights get decapitated and eaten, their sugar weapons shattered. Your stomach, now containing both savoury animals and sweet architecture, sends confused signals. Your past full, past uncomfortable, into that territory where you're just accepting that yes, this is your life now. You contain multitudes, specifically multiple animal species and a castle wall. The hypocrite helps cutting through the sugar, warming away discomfort. You sip, you breathe, and you wait for the next course, because surely there can't be much more. Surely even medieval banquets have limits. Right, the sugar castle ruins are being cleared when something arrives that looks almost normal. Finally, a dish that appears to be just food. White food, granted oddly pale and smooth in a way that seems suspicious after everything you've experienced tonight, but at least it's not gilded or reconstructed or architecturally implausible. The servant announces it blanc mange. You nod like you understand, while internally you're thinking, what fresh hell is this? Blancmange, literally white food in French, was medieval cuisine's answer to a question nobody asked. What if we made something that combined chicken, almonds, rice and sugar into a pale, smooth dish that defied all culinary logic? and yet for centuries this was considered refined eating, the kind of thing you served when you wanted to demonstrate sophistication rather than excess. The recipe varied by region, but the core remained consistent. Take chicken breast, sometimes fish, during fasting periods, pound it into submission until it's basically paste. Mix it with ground almonds, rice flour, sugar, and sometimes rose water. Cook it all into a thick, pale pudding-like consistency. The result was white or near white, hence the name, with a texture somewhere between custard and paste and nothing quite familiar. The colour obsession was real. Medieval aesthetics prized whiteness in food, associating it with purity, refinement, and expense. White foods required ingredient expense. Almonds weren't cheap sugar, even less so. And achieving that pale colour meant using only the finest parts of the chicken. Dark meat wouldn't work. Blood or off colours were unacceptable. You wanted snowy whiteness, ethereal and elegant. Your portion arrives in a small dish. Blancmange was served in modest amounts, unlike the massive slabs of meat you've been battling all evening. It looks almost like pudding, smooth and pale with a slight sheen. The smell is subtle, slightly sweet, with almond notes and something floral that's probably rose water. Nothing about it screams chicken, which is either reassuring or deeply unsettling. You take a spoonful. The texture is strange smooth, but with slight graininess from the rice flour, creamy from the almonds, with small strands of chicken so thoroughly incorporated you'd never identify them blind. The taste is equally confused sweet, definitely, but also savoury undertones from the chicken, floral notes from rosewater, nutty richness from almonds. Your brain can't quite categorise it. Dessert main course. Some strange liminal food that exists between categories. That ambiguity was intentional. Blancmange appeared at different points in medieval meals depending on local custom. Sometimes it came early, a delicate course to prepare palates for heavier foods. Sometimes it appeared late, a gentle finish after hours of aggressive meat consumption. Its versatility made it popular. You could adjust sweetness, making it more dessert-like or more savoury depending on context. The chicken component baffles modern minds, but medieval logic made it make sense. Chicken was considered gentle, easy to digest, appropriate for invalids and those with delicate constitutions. Almonds were cooling and moistening according to humoral theory. Rice was binding and nourishing. Combine them, and you had a dish that was theoretically perfectly balanced, healthful, restorative. That it also happened to be delicious by medieval standards was bonus. Historians still argue whether people genuinely enjoyed blancmange or just ate it because it signalled refinement. Period sources praise it in elaborate terms suggesting real appreciation. But those same sources praised lots of things that modern palates find baffling, so perhaps medieval taste preferences were genuinely different. Or perhaps everyone was performing sophistication while privately thinking, this is weird chicken pudding. Regional variations created interesting diversity. English blancmange leaned sweeter with more sugar and almond milk. French versions were more savoury, sometimes omitting sugar entirely. Italian variants incorporated spices, cinnamon, ginger, creating more complex flavour profiles. Spanish recipes sometimes included saffron, turning the white food golden and defeating the entire naming concept. The dish required serious kitchen skill. Pounding chicken breast to smooth paste without any modern equipment was labour-intensive. Grinding almonds fine enough to create smooth texture rather than grainy paste took time and effort. Cooking everything to the right consistency, thick enough to hold shape but not gluey or stiff, required attention and experience. Blancmange was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. It also travelled well, relatively speaking. The thick consistency meant it could sit at room temperature during long banquets without separating or spoiling immediately. This made it practical for elaborate meals where courses might wait hours before serving. Blancmange could be made ahead, stored, then brought out whenever the meal flow required. Practical elegance. By the Renaissance, blancmange was evolving. The chicken started disappearing from recipes replaced by more cream and eggs, transforming it into the dessert most modern people recognize as sweet almond-flavored pudding without any poultry confusion. This version persisted into Victorian times and beyond becoming nursery food comfort food, the kind of gentle dessert you'd serve invalids. But medieval blancmange with its chicken almond rice confusion mostly vanished. Modern recipe reconstructions exist. Food historians have made it, tasted it, documented reactions. The consensus seems to be interesting, but we understand why this didn't survive. The sweet-savoury combination doesn't appeal to palates trained on clear categorical boundaries between dessert and meat. You finish your portion surprised that something so strange went down so easily after the parade of challenging foods. Blancmange is gentle refined in a way that peacock and beaver tail weren't. It doesn't assault your palate or challenge your digestion. It just sits there pale and mysterious, tasting of almonds and medieval aesthetics. Around the table reactions are mixed. Some guests are eating enthusiastically. Blancmange has its devotees. Others are picking at it uncertainly, perhaps confused by the same sweet savoury ambiguity that's puzzling you. A few have barely touched theirs, either full beyond capacity or uninterested in pale chicken pudding after the evening's excesses. Your stomach accepts it without protest, possibly grateful for something that isn't aggressively fatty or challenging. The gentle sweetness helps settle things or at least distracts from the mass of meat organs and sugar currently occupying your digestive system. You sip more Hippocras at this point, you're just drinking steadily, no longer tracking how many cups you've had. The spiced wine and the pale pudding combine into something almost pleasant, a moment of calm in the chaotic banquet. The servants are moving again. Something else is coming. Your capacity for surprise is nearly exhausted, but medieval banquets don't care about your emotional bandwidth. There are still courses pending, still more ways to demonstrate wealth through consumption. You settle back, breathe, and prepare. The night isn't over yet. The blancmange dishes are being cleared when the next presentation arrives, and honestly at this point your sense of what's normal has been so thoroughly destroyed that you just accept what you're seeing. Meat suspended in transparent gel wobbling on platters like something from a fever dream. Everything is shimmering, translucent, catching the candlelight and reflecting it in wobbly waves. You're looking at aspic savoury jelly, made from boiled bones and cartilage, and the medieval world's absolute obsession with making food wobble. Gelatin dishes were everywhere in medieval high-status dining. If you could jellify it, you did. Meat in jelly, fish in jelly, vegetables in jelly, eggs in jelly, sometimes just jelly by itself, coloured and moulded into decorative shapes. The wobblier your food, the more sophisticated your kitchen. This was the medieval equivalent of molecular gastronomy using ingredient chemistry to create textures that seemed almost magical. The process was labour-intensive, and that was exactly the point. To make proper aspic, you needed to simmer bones cartilage, pig's feet, fish bones, anything with high collagen content for hours, extracting the gelatin into the liquid. Then you'd clarify it using egg whites and crushed shells, creating transparent broth. Pour that over arranged meats or fish, let it cool and set, and you had food encased in shimmering gel. The effort involved signalled wealth. You had fuel to burn for hours, servants to tend the pot, and time to waste on making food that was already cooked even more elaborate. Your portion is a slice of what appears to be chicken in amber jelly, the meat visible through the translucent gel like prehistoric insects in resin. There are herbs suspended in the jelly to parsley, maybe thyme frozen in place creating an edible terrarium. The whole thing wobbles when the platter is set down, waves of gelatin motion, rippling through the assembled dishes. You prod it with your knife. The jelly gives, then springs back, then finally yields with a slight schlup sound. You cut through to the chicken underneath, and a small amount of savoury liquid oozes out. The gelatin is melting slightly in the warm hall. The smell is meaty, with that distinctive gelatin aroma that's hard to describe but unmistakable once you've encountered it. The first bite is a textural experience that your medieval banquet-exhausted brain struggles to process. The jelly is cool, smooth, melting on your tongue into savoury liquid. Then comes the chicken, normal enough by comparison. The flavours are fine, the meat was cooked in the broth that became the jelly, so everything's integrated. But the texture, that cool, wobbling slipperiness, takes adjustment. Medieval diners apparently loved this. Account books show enormous quantities of ingredients purchased specifically for aspic and jelly dishes. Cookbooks devote entire sections to gelatin preparation, with elaborate instructions for achieving clarity, proper set, and attractive presentation. This wasn't occasional novelty, this was a regular feature of high-status dining. The wobble itself had symbolic weight. Gelatin's transformation from liquid to solid seemed almost alchemical, the kind of kitchen magic that demonstrated mastery over ingredients. Being able to suspend foods in perfect clarity showed control skill and access to the right materials. Cloudy aspic was failure. Aspic that didn't set was humiliation, but crystal clear jelly perfectly firm holding meats in artistic arrangement, that was triumph. Different meats got the aspic treatment for different occasions. Eel in jelly appeared frequently. The fish's natural sliminess apparently made it aspic compatible in medieval minds. Pork in jelly was common, the meat's fat content creating particularly rich gelatin. Even tongue in jelly showed up that large muscular organ sliced and suspended in amber wobbles. Historians still argue whether the preservation aspect mattered. Aspic did help food last slightly longer, or if it was purely aesthetic. Fish aspic had its own category. During Lenten fasting, when meat aspic was forbidden, fishbone gelatin took over. Pike in jelly, salmon in jelly, basically any fish that provided good bone structure for gelatin extraction. The process was identical, just with fish bones simmered instead of meat bones. The church approved because technically it's still fish, just fish that happens to be wobbling mysteriously. Colour played into presentation. Natural aspic was amber or pale yellow, but cooks could enhance it. Saffron made it golden. Certain herbs made it greenish. Blood could darken it. Yes, blood aspic existed, combining the blood pudding concept with the jelly obsession into something that sounds like culinary horror. Layered jellies with different colours created striped effects when sliced rainbow wobbles that probably looked better than they tasted. The medieval jelly obsession continued well past the Middle Ages. Victorian England went absolutely insane for aspic and moulded gelatin dishes, creating towering, savoury jellies that graced every proper dinner table. Even into the mid-20th century, American home cooking featured endless variations of things suspended in gelatin. The horrifying Jell-O salads of the 1950s were medieval aspic's distant descendants, though nobody making them probably realised they were continuing centuries-old tradition. Modern palates have mostly rejected savoury gelatin. We'll eat fruit in Jell-O, barely, but meat in wobbling translucent gel seems wrong now. Food scientists and historians occasionally make medieval aspic for educational purposes, and reactions are universally, "This is interesting." That's food history code for "I'm glad we stopped doing this." You finish your portion feeling the cool gelatin slide down your throat, liquefying as it goes. Your mouth feels slightly coated, that distinctive gelatin film that lingers. Around you, nobles are consuming their wobbling portions with varying enthusiasm. Some treat it as delicacy, savouring the texture. Others are eating mechanically, just getting through it because it's there, and refusing would be rude. The platters are still half full when servants begin clearing them. Apparently not everyone shares medieval enthusiasm for meat jelly. The uneaten portions will cascade down through the household hierarchy, perhaps to servants who'll appreciate the protein even in its wobbly form, perhaps to dogs who won't question why their dinner jiggles. Your stomach now contains wobbling gelatin alongside everything else, the menagerie of animals, the organs, the sugar castle, the gold leaf that's travelling unchanged through your digestive tract. You're a walking medieval banquet, every course represented in your increasingly protesting gut. The hippocras helps. It always helps. You drink more grateful for liquid that doesn't wobble for warmth, that cuts through the cool gelatin film for alcohol, that's making this entire evening feel slightly less surreal than it actually is. More courses are coming. They're always coming. The meal continues because medieval banquets don't end, they just eventually run out of things to serve, and even then they'll find something. You settle back, breathe deeply, and wonder if medieval nobles ever got used to this, or if every banquet was an endurance test they just learned to survive with practice and hippocras. The aspic wobbles are finally gone when servants bring out something that at first you think might be the meal's merciful conclusion. Small bowls arrive, each containing what looks like food broken down to its most elemental form, bone fragments split lengthwise, revealing the soft, fatty tissue inside. And next to that, something even more unsettling, what appears to be brains pale and convoluted, sitting in their own rendered fat. You've reached the marrow and brain course, the medieval finale, where diners literally sucked nutrition from the innermost parts of animals. Marrow was considered the ultimate delicacy, the richest, most nourishing part of any animal. To access it, bones were roasted until the marrow inside turned soft and creamy. Then they were brought to table, where diners would use specialized narrow spoons, or just their fingers, to scoop out the fatty contents. The taste was intensely rich, almost buttery, pure concentrated animal fat with a subtle meaty undertone. This was protein and calories in their most condensed form, the stuff that sustained you through medieval winters when other food grew scarce. But marrow was also symbolic. Eating the innermost part of the bone represented consuming the animal's essence, its vitality, its strength. Medical texts praised marrow for building blood, strengthening bones, restoring vigor to the weak and ill. Athletes ate it. Warriors ate it. Anyone recovering from illness got fed marrow broth. This wasn't just food, it was medicine, sustenance, and status symbol combined. Your bowl contains a split beef bone, maybe 8 inches long, roasted, until the marrow inside is soft and golden. The smell is rich, almost overwhelming in its fattiness. You pick up the bone, it's still warm, and use the small narrow spoon provided to dig into the marrow. It comes out easily soft and yielding, glistening with rendered fat. You taste it. The flavour is extraordinary. Rich doesn't begin to cover it. This is concentrated animal essence, fatty and savoury, and somehow both meaty and not quite meaty at the same time. The texture is smooth, almost creamy, melting on your tongue and coating your mouth with richness. It's not unpleasant, actually. If your stomach weren't already staging a full rebellion, you might find this delicious. But after everything tonight, this level of fat intensity feels like a final test of your digestive capacity. Around the table, nobles are attacking their bones with enthusiasm, scraping out every bit of marrow, some even cracking the bones further to access smaller pockets of fat. This is the course where table manners relax slightly. You're allowed to be enthusiastic, to get your fingers greasy, to really dig into the bones. There's something primal about it, something that connects these overdressed nobles to their hunting ancestors who cracked bones around fires thousands of years ago. The brains sit beside the marrow, and honestly, you're not sure you can face this. Brains were another medieval delicacy prized for their soft texture and delicate flavour. They required careful preparation, too much heat, and they'd become grainy and unpleasant. Done right, they were custard-like, mild, rich, without being overwhelming. They were often poached gently in wine or broth, sometimes fried in butter, occasionally incorporated into pies or scrambled with eggs. Your portion is small, maybe a tablespoon of brain tissue, pale and soft, sitting in a pool of butter. The smell is subtle, almost nutty, with that distinctive organ meat quality underneath. You take a tiny bite. The texture is indeed custard-like, smooth and creamy, with a flavour that's mild, slightly sweet, with metallic undertones that announce this is definitely brain tissue. It's not terrible. It's just brain. You're eating thoughts, or at least the organ that once had them, and that fact sits heavily alongside the taste. Medieval medical theory praised brain specifically. Cured like the doctrine suggested, so eating brains strengthened your own brain, improved memory, enhanced intelligence. Whether anyone actually believed this or just enjoyed having an excuse to eat organ meat is unclear, but brains appeared regularly at high-status tables served to honoured guests as a mark of respect and access. Different animals provided different brain experiences. Calf brains were considered finest, large enough to be substantial, mild enough to be pleasant. Lamb brains were smaller but more delicate. Pig brains were common, but sometimes considered less refined. Game animal brains, deer boar, had stronger flavours that required more aggressive seasoning. Each had their devotees, their preferred preparations, their place in the culinary hierarchy. The preparation challenges were real. Brains are delicate membrane-covered and need careful cleaning before cooking. Medieval kitchen staff would soak them in water, carefully peel away the membranes, remove any blood vessels, then handle them gently throughout cooking. Overcooked brain became grainy, crumbly, unpleasant. Undercooked brain was, well, raw brain, which even medieval diners found unappealing. Historians still argue whether brain consumption was genuinely widespread or limited to elite tables. The organ's delicacy and quick spoilage made it impractical for most people. You needed fresh killed animals and immediate preparation. This kept brains mostly in noble kitchens where animals were butchered on site for feasts. Common folk might eat brains during home slaughter of their own animals, but probably not regularly. Combined with marrow, this course represented consuming the animal's most precious internal resources, not the muscles that provided labour, not the organs that maintained life, but the fatty essence and the thinking centre, the parts considered most valuable, most vital, most worth reserving for the end of an elaborate meal. You finish your small portion of brain unable to eat more. The marrow bone sits in your bowl mostly scraped clean, a few traces of fat still clinging to the interior. Your fingers are greasy, your mouth coated with fat, your stomach at absolute capacity. This has to be the end. Surely even medieval excess has limits. Surely after marrow and brains there's nothing left to serve. But the servants are circulating again, this time with small glasses containing amber liquid. Not hippocras, something else. Something that smells intensely sour, almost vinegary. You catch the word as it's served verjuice. The acidic finale to cut through hours of fat and protein to cleanse palates to prepare nobles for whatever impossibly comes next, or perhaps just to help them survive what they've already consumed. Around you, nobles are drinking, making faces at the sourness, then laughing and calling for more. The meal is reaching its conclusion finally, maybe hopefully. Your body is ready. Your mind is ready. You've consumed a small zoo architectural sugar precious metals and the innermost parts of multiple animal species. Surely that's enough for one evening. Surely medieval hospitality doesn't demand more. The servants keep moving. The night continues. And you realize with something between resignation and awe that medieval banquets don't end because the food runs out. They end because eventually everyone's too drunk or too full to continue. You're approaching that threshold. The hall is too. The final courses are coming. Thank God. The marrow grease is still on your fingers when those small glasses of verjuice arrive, and the smell alone makes your eyes water slightly. It's intensely sour, not vinegar exactly, but close with a fruity sharpness that cuts through the fog of fat coating your mouth. This is the final course, the digestive, the medieval equivalent of a palate cleanser, except it's also somehow the defining flavour of an entire era's cuisine. Verjuice, literally green juice, was made from unripe grapes, pressed and fermented, just slightly creating an acidic liquid that medieval cooks used the way we use lemon juice or vinegar. Except it was everywhere. In sauces, in marinades, as a beverage, as medicine. If medieval cuisine had a defining taste beyond heavily spiced meat, it was this sharp, green, aggressively sour quality that verjuice provided. You lift the small glass and take a sip. The sourness hits immediately, making your mouth pucker, saliva flooding in response. But underneath the acidity, there's something else, a subtle fruity sweetness, a complexity that straight vinegar lacks. It's astringent mouth coating and strangely refreshing after hours of fat and richness. Your stomach, which has been protesting for the last several courses, actually seems to settle slightly. Maybe there was something to medieval digestive theory after all. The use of unripe fruit defined medieval flavour profiles in ways we've completely lost. Modern palates expect fruits to be sweet, ripe, candy-like. Medieval Europe used them sour, unripe grapes for verjuice, unripe apples for similar acidic juices, green plums, crab apples, anything tart and sharp. This wasn't poverty forcing them to harvest early. This was deliberate preference for acidic flavours that we've since abandoned almost entirely. Some historians argue this reflected preservation technology's sour liquids kept better than sweet ones in an era without refrigeration. Others suggest it was medical humoral theory, held that excessive sweetness created imbalance, while sourness was cooling, drying, beneficial. Still others think it was simply taste preference, that medieval palates genuinely enjoyed aggressive acidity in ways modern ones don't. Verjuice appeared in nearly every sauce recipe. That crane you ate earlier, probably served with verjuice-based sauce. The pork from the cockentrice, likely basted with verjuice and spices. Even sweet dishes sometimes incorporated it, creating sweet-sour combinations that sound bizarre, but apparently worked for medieval diners. Blancmange recipes sometimes called for verjuice to balance the sweetness. Meat pies got verjuice in their fillings. It was medieval MSG, the secret ingredient that made everything taste more intense, more medieval. Regional variations existed. Northern European verjuice tended toward green grape versions, very sour, almost harsh. Mediterranean regions sometimes used other sour fruits, pomegranate, citrus, when available, creating more complex acid profiles. Some areas fermented their verjuice longer, making it closer to wine vinegar. Others kept it fresh, using it within weeks of pressing. The decline of verjuice tracks with the rise of citrus cultivation in Europe. As lemons became more available and affordable, cooks gradually switched to lemon juice for their acid needs. Lemons were more consistent, easier to store, and provided cleaner acidity without verjuice's complex funk. By the Renaissance, verjuice was fading from elite kitchens relegated to rural areas where traditional methods persisted. But tonight in this hall verjuice reigns. Everyone's sipping it, making faces at the sourness, then nodding appreciatively as their fat-coated mouths clear. Some are calling for seconds, using it to literally wash away the evening's excesses. The acid cuts through everything, the marrow fat, the jellied aspic coating the hypocras sweetness, even the memory of that damned gilded swan. You take another sip longer this time, letting the sourness work its magic. Your stomach actually does feel better. Maybe it's the acid stimulating digestion. Maybe it's psychological, the meal is ending finally and the verjuice signals conclusion. Or maybe medieval medicine knew something we've forgotten about acids and digestion, and this sour finale was genuinely therapeutic after hours of protein and fat. Around the table, nobles are standing now, stretching, laughing loudly, faces flushed from wine and heat and relief that the meal is finally actually truly ending. Servants are clearing the last dishes, the bones and glasses and trenchers soak through with hours of drippings. Musicians in the corner, silent through most of the meal, are starting to play Dancing Will Follow, because apparently consuming several animals and your body weight in spiced wine isn't enough entertainment for one evening. You stand carefully testing your balance. The hypocras has done its work. You're pleasantly drunk, not incapacitated, just warm and loose and ready to forget that you spent the last 4 hours eating increasingly implausible foods. Your stomach is a chaotic museum of medieval cuisine, lamprey, peacock, porpoise, swan, hedgehog, crane, beaver tail, seal puffin, songbirds, fetal lamb, cockentrice, blood pudding, humble pie organs, gilded meat, hypocras sugar, castle blancmange aspic, marrow brains, and now verjuice trying heroically to make sense of it all. This was wealth. This was power. This was medieval nobility announcing through food that they controlled resources you couldn't imagine, had access to animals you'd never see, could command kitchen staff to perform culinary impossibilities. Every course was a statement. Every bizarre dish was a flex. And you, by consuming it all, participated in that display, became part of the performance, proved your own status through your ability to endure. Tomorrow you'll feel terrible. Your digestive system will exact revenge for tonight's abuses. You'll swear off rich food, pledge moderation, promise yourself you'll never eat like this again. But nobles do this regularly, multiple times a month, sometimes weekly, and somehow survive. Maybe you develop tolerance. Maybe your body adapts. Or maybe they just accept chronic indigestion as the price of status. The hall is emptying now, guests moving toward the dancing chamber, or just collapsing in corners too full and drunk to move further. You stand in place, still tasting verjuice, still feeling marrow fat coating your teeth, still unable to quite believe everything that just happened. The trenchers are being collected. Yours is completely disintegrated. Bread transformed into greasy sponge that will feed someone somewhere, continuing the cascade of food through the social hierarchy. Medieval dining wasn't about nutrition. It wasn't really even about taste, despite all the spices and sauces. It was about power displayed through consumption, about demonstrating that you could, so you did, about participating in shared excess that bonded nobles together while separating them from everyone else. You didn't just eat differently from peasants, you ate different animals, different preparations, different worlds entirely, and now it's over. The meal ends. Not with satisfaction, your stomach is too confused for that, but with completion. You survived. You consumed the impossible. You participated in medieval excess and lived to regret it. The verjuice glass empties. The servants bow. The evening concludes. You step toward the doorway, moving carefully, feeling the weight of everything you've eaten, everything you've witnessed, everything you've somehow become by participating in this elaborate ritual of consumption. The cool night air will feel good. Your bed will feel better. And tomorrow, when your body reminds you of tonight's choices, you'll remember this was delicacy. This was sophistication. This was medieval Europe's unbelievable feast. And you were there eating golden organs and wobbling jellies, living history one implausible course at a time. The fire has burned low now, hasn't it? Just embers glowing soft and warm like the memory of that final sip of verjuice still tingling on your tongue. You've travelled through centuries tonight, tasted things that seemed impossible, survived a banquet that would have challenged even the heartiest medieval noble. Your mind holds these images now, the lamprey's gleaming slime, the peacock's impossible plumage, those tiny songbirds crunching between teeth, the wobbling aspic catching candlelight like captured time. These weren't just foods, they were stories. Each course carried the weight of forests and rivers of hunting rites and church debates of kitchen staff working through the night to create edible impossibilities. The people who ate these things really ate them, not as curiosity but as life. They understood something we've lost. That food connects us to landscape, to season, to the animals we share this world with. That eating is never just eating. It's always ritual, always meaning, always something larger. Close your eyes now. Let the medieval hall fade back into history where it belongs. Those nobles, those servants, those impossible dishes, they've returned to the past, leaving only the faint taste of spiced wine and the echo of laughter around long-vanished tables. You're here now, safe and comfortable, with sensible food waiting for tomorrow. No lampreys, no gilded swans, just the ordinary miracle of another day. The candles are guttering. The last servants are banking the fires. Somewhere in the dark an owl calls just a bird, not a course, not a symbol, just itself. And that's enough. That's always been enough. Rest now. Let history settle. Let those unbelievable delicacies fade into dream and memory, where perhaps they belonged all along. The story ends here. Sleep well. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.